Hello, and welcome back to yet another video. This is the fourth episode of the story in which Naruto decides to start learning sealing arts. Like and subscribe to show your support. Let's get this show started. Back in Konoha, Kakashi found he didn't have much of a report left to give, since most of it had already been sent to the Hokage through Naruto's messenger tube. So it didn't take him long to pass along the few remaining details once they'd returned to Konoha. "Thank you," the old Hokage said, nodding as Kakashi finished. "You did exceptional work. Although, I must ask, the Great Naruto Bridge?" "Ah, well, you see," Kakashi said as he rubbed the back of his head sheepishly, trying to think of a way to explain just how the bridge had come to be named after Naruto when he himself wasn't too clear on anything other than the villagers getting wind of Naruto's massive use of Kage Bunshine on the bridge during their last week there, and Sasuke and Sakura wanting to make amends with Naruto. And thinking that it was hilarious that another monument would be named after him. The Hokage just raised an eyebrow at him. You had to have been there, I guess," he finally said. "This is becoming quite a habit," the Hokage said mildly. "It isn't often a Jonin has a single major monument named in their honor, much less two." Kakashi laughed nervously. "Nevertheless, I'll note a commendation in all of your files for your team's work. It's extraordinary such a rookie Jonin team could accomplish so much," he said. "Now we need to discuss one of your students." "Yes," Kakashi agreed. "I need to know everything you do about Naruto." Kakashi noted the small signs of the Hokage's surprise, and wondered who he'd thought they were going to talk about. "Ah. Yes, Naruto," the Hokage said, steepling his hands in front of him. "Unfortunately, the fact is that I do not know much." "But how can that be?" Kakashi asked, taken aback by the answer. The third sighed and turned to look out the window. When Naruto was a very young child, just a toddler, in fact he was removed from the orphanage, the Hokage told him. "I was not informed until at least a week had passed, and I have still been unable to determine exactly who removed him and how." He must have seen the skepticism Kakashi felt. "That doesn't mean there weren't consequences. Not knowing precisely who was involved didn't stop me from demonstrating my displeasure to everyone who might have been involved, through either action or inaction. And believe me, I was very displeased." Kakashi's nodded. The third may have appeared to be grandfatherly, but then, he was one of the best shinobi to ever live and had no issue with exploiting people's perceptions of him. That someone might have been good enough to pull one over on the third was difficult to comprehend, but it made slightly more sense to Kakashi that Naruto had somehow wound up in the Akasen when he knew that the Hokage hadn't been able to locate him. It had been incomprehensible to Kakashi that Naruto would grow up as he had if the Hokage truly had been watching over his shoulder, as Kakashi had always imagined. "I didn't see him again until he showed up here one day quite at random to gain the necessary permission to apply for the Academy's preparatory school," the third explained. "I approved it, of course, and the boy was gone again before I could make too many inquiries of him. Since then, on the few occasions I've had to see the boy, whenever I broach the topic Naruto manages to change the subject and then seems to disappear completely, from both my office and Konoha as a whole." Kakashi tried to take in what the third was telling him. He'd seen Naruto's disappearing act personally, so part of the tale he knew could be true. And he could imagine Naruto keeping secrets from the Hokage without too much difficulty. He was remarkably cagey and tight-lipped when he wanted to be. But the rest of it? He found it difficult to believe that the Hokage would allow the container of the nine-tailed fox to go missing for any length of time. The academy started at 8, and the prep school was a year before that, so if the Hokage were telling him the truth, Naruto would have been missing for 4 or 5 years. Konoha just wasn't big enough for Kakashi to swallow that easily. There was more to this story. The Hokage just didn't want to share. "I tell you all of this in the strictest confidence, you understand," the Hokage said. Of course, Kakashi agreed. Especially since the Hokage had told him much less that might be of any use than Naruto himself had shared. There was one more thing. "He wants to tell his teammates." The Hokage blinked in surprise. "About his burden?" the Hokage clarified. When Kakashi nodded, the Hokage put his hand on his chin, stroking his beard in thought. "They're good kids," Kakashi said. "They won't do anything potentially dangerous with the knowledge. I would impress upon them the importance of that." He didn't bother with the arguments about it being Naruto's right to tell his friends, or that he deserved the opportunity to share it with the people he cared about. Such arguments, he knew, wouldn't sway the Hokage on a matter of village security. "This requires thought. I will consider the matter. Until then, it remains a class secret. Do you understand?" And Kakashi knew he meant, "Do you understand you must tell Naruto no until I say otherwise?" "Hi, Hokage-sama," Kakashi demurred. Good, the Hokage said. Then for now, I'll only say this, I am old, Kakashi, and had I a successor, I would certainly allow this decision to be his, as the repercussions would mostly fall onto his shoulders. Kakashi slouched a bit, displeased by the implication. It wasn't even close to the first time the Hokage had brought up with him the idea of becoming his successor. If it had been, he doubted Danzo would ever have cared enough about him to start those rumors. But it was the first time he'd added a carrot and a stick to the offer. Because at the same time he was implying he would allow Kakashi to make the call once he accepted the position, he was also hinting that he could hold out from making any decision at all until Kakashi accepted. Kakashi was reasonably certain he had no desire at all to become Hokage, so that could be a rather long wait. I see, was all Kakashi said. As upset as he was over the Hokage's initial evasion of his questions combined with the anger that the Hokage was willing to use his kids to manipulate him, he had a very great deal more he could have said already perched on the tip of his tongue, but he forced it to stay there. The Hokage was remarkably tolerant when compared to the cages of the other great nations, but some of the things Kakashi wanted to say would likely push even Sarutobi's renowned patience. The Hokage nodded, then changed the topic. Then let us continue. Naruto wasn't the student I wanted to discuss. Oh? Then who was? Kakashi asked curiously, putting everything else out of his mind for the moment. It wasn't doing him any good there at the moment, anyway. Haruno Sakura, the Hokage said. I'm afraid I have some unfortunate news. That's a horrible thing to say, she whispered. You're lying. Sakura, Kakashi said. I wish I were. No. No, it can't be true, she said, voice beginning to rise with panic. My parents aren't dead. They're not. A patrol found them on their way back from Ipana. Their entire caravan died along with the team hired to guard them. Kakashi thought it better to give her all of the facts at once than to piecemeal the information and create a new blow with each new fact. The tears began streaming down Sakura's face as the shock began to wear a bit off and reality began to set in. She collapsed forward, and Kakashi caught her and held her in his lap, offering what small comfort he could. I'm so sorry, Sakura, Kakashi murmured as he stroked her back, letting her cry herself out against him. It was a few minutes later when Naruto and Sasuke came back from where he'd sent them off so he could tell her the news in privacy. Their eyes immediately snapped to Kakashi, silently asking what had happened. He tilted his head to the file lying on the table, and the boys quickly skimmed through it. He knew the moment they saw their bodies tensed and they looked first to each other, then to him and Sakura. The boys immediately rushed over, and Kakashi found himself with three 12-year-olds practically sitting in his lap. They're gone, Sakura managed through her tears. Mama and Papa. They're gone. Naruto rubbed her back and squeezed Sasuke and Kakashi, obviously unsure of what else to do. Kakashi silently wished him luck in figuring it out, because he himself had no clue. We'll take care of you, Sakura-kun, Sasuke murmured softly. We've got you. You're not alone. Remember that. No matter what, you're not alone. When Sakura finally fell asleep, Kakashi and the boys continued to sit there for a few minutes before Naruto disentangled himself. Kakashi was more than a little surprised when Sasuke made no move to do the same. The boy was pricklier than a thorn bush at times, and physical touch was always a difficult issue for him. But for the moment anyway, he seemed content to stay tucked against Kakashi's side, curled into Sakura and Kakashi both. Naruto picked up the file he and Sasuke had skimmed earlier, and Kakashi knew he was committing it to memory. The report says they were just regular bandits. Naruto didn't look up from the file as he took care to speak softly enough to not wake Sakura. Even a weak Shinon team would have been able to fight off bandits. Or at least their Jounin-sensei should have. So why didn't they hire one? They've done this route for years, they knew the dangers. They did, Kakashi said. Naruto raised an eyebrow and turned to the end of the report where the mission was listed. There's no way this could have been bandits, right? Naruto asked. Kakashi nodded his agreement, but didn't have any answers. I want to see this ambush site, Naruto said. Sakura-kun can't stay alone tonight, Sasuke said. Naruto shook his head in agreement. Don't think you're going alone, Sasuke warned. Don't think either of you are going anywhere tonight, Kakashi countered. He had a violent need to get all of his kids back somewhere safe and keep a very close watch over them. I want all of you to bunk with me tonight, Kakashi said, nudging Sasuke to move so he could get up. Then he stood, carrying the sleeping Sakura against his chest, and motioned the boys to take the file and Sakura's equipment and began heading towards his apartment. Well, the real us will, Naruto said as though that were obvious. Of course we're staying with Sakura-kun. But that doesn't mean we can't still check out the ambush site. Kakashi raised an eyebrow, silently asking how Naruto planned to stay with Sakura and go scout the location her parents had died at the same time. Onigiri Bunshine? Sasuke asked. Naruto nodded. You'll come, too, right Kakashi-sensei? Naruto asked, tugging at his Jounin vest as he looked up at him with a hint of uncertainty playing across his face. Kakashi rapidly analyzed the pros and cons of going with them versus ordering them to stay. They should stay. They weren't authorized to leave the village for this. They were all tired, and they were unlikely to find anything the Anbu hadn't noted in their report. And Sakura needed them. But Naruto was absolutely right about the inconsistency of saying simple bandits had been able to take down a Jounin and his Jonin team. And Kakashi really did want to see the ambush site. And, if he ordered them to stay, he wasn't certain he wanted to test whether they would or not. I'll go, Kakashi confirmed. Naruto nodded and pulled out 2 sets of seals. From where, Kakashi wasn't certain, but he'd stopped being surprised when Naruto popped seals out of what seemed like thin air. Sasuke hiked up his shirt and turned, letting Naruto place one of the seals on the small of his back, then swipe it with a sliced, bloody finger. Moments later, another Sasuke was in the room. Your turn, sensei, Naruto offered. I can make my own cage Bunshine, he reminded the boys. Yeah, but, well, Naruto stammered, scratching his head. They aren't as good, you know? What if you get hit with something? Kakashi raised an eyebrow. He wasn't some green Jonin after all. Please, sensei? Naruto asked. And Kakashi noted that even Sasuke seemed to be watching him intently. He shrugged, supposing there was no harm in it, and nodded. Naruto repeated the process, and Kakashi shuddered at the strange sensation of a foreign non-medical chakra coursing through him, especially one that was so volatile. That feels really strange, Kakashi said even as another copy of him showed up. Naruto looked away, then shrugged and tossed a seal out which shortly became a Naruto clone. That wasn't a criticism, Naruto, Kakashi said, wishing he had a free hand to do something to reassure Naruto, who had remained sensitive to any perceived disapproval and had been noticeably emotionally vulnerable even after their talk? Meltdown? Group therapy session? After their leaving wave? He was glad when his clone apparently had the same thought and smoothed Naruto's hair down. Or tried to, anyway. You've come up with an amazing technique. But having foreign chakra invade my system is still unsettling, no matter how useful the jutsu, Kakashi said, suddenly so exhausted he could barely stand. He had 3 remarkable students who he had no doubt would one day be legends. But he also knew that his 3 remarkable students were also remarkably traumatized, each in their own way. And that they'd grow into legends only if he could get them through their adolescence. No small feat, even for a Jounin with normal children. Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura were far from normal children. You 3 should head out, he told the clones. Come on, the Kakashi copy said, and the Naruto clone and Sasuke clone both followed him as he melted into the shadows to sneak out of the village. Kakashi wondered whether he should have more qualms than he did about showing to Jonin how to leave the village undetected, then decided that they likely would have found a way to manage it on their own anyway. The village's defenses were geared a great deal more towards keeping people out than in, after all. And, if Kakashi showed them the way, he would at least know where to start looking if they ever tried to use it on their own one day. Then Sasuke's hand reached out and brushed the hair away from Sakura's face where it had covered her eyes as Kakashi had carried her. And he knew that, no matter what happened, so long as these kids had each other they'd turn out just fine. He knew they were only clones, but Kakashi couldn't help but be proud of his boys and their ability to move. He'd been traveling quickly, and they hadn't had any trouble keeping up. No matter how they complained, those laps around the lake had definitely been good for them. He wondered whether they'd be faster if it had been the real Sasuke and Naruto instead of their clones. That they'd also been able to follow him out of the village without alerting any of the village's security, while equally impressive, was expected of them at this point. If it hadn't been, he never would have agreed to the outing in the first place. He flicked his hand out, using the sign language he'd been drilling into them to let the boys know their target wasn't far away. They were there a few moments later and Kakashi frowned as he took in the remnants of the site. There were clear signs of shinobi involvement, slashes in trees from kunai, a burned spot on the ground from too much chakra in too concentrated a spot, markings in the bark on branches where shinobi sandals had tread. Sensei? Sasuke said, pointing towards a shuriken stuck in a branch. This couldn't have been bandits, right? Naruto asked, eyeing it. Couldn't have been? I wouldn't say that, Kakashi answered. There's always a possibility things aren't as they seem. But in this case, I would say that possibility is very, very small. That the Haruno's trading caravan had been attacked so deep within Fire's border was bad. That the Jinan team they'd hired as escorts hadn't been able to defend them was worse. That somehow the Anbu who'd found the site and made the report had either missed the signs that it had been Shinobi who'd attacked, or had deliberately left that information out of the report was catastrophic. You aren't to speak of this outside of my presence, do you understand? Kakashi ordered. They clearly didn't, but nodded anyway. And he knew that in this, they would do as he said. Good. Now dispel yourselves. He waited until they had, making sure they were truly gone before continuing the investigation on his own. The next morning, a pounding on the door woke them all up. Kakashi was disoriented for a moment as he took in the fact that, while he was definitely in his own bed, he had 3 warm lumps in bed with him. Then, as the pounding resumed, he remembered. Who the fuck is it? Naruto mumbled. Kakashi sighed, scooting Sakura carefully off of him and onto a pillow even as Sasuke and Naruto shifted out of his way. Kakashi, get your ass out here, came the voice from the other side of the door. Asuma, Kakashi recognized as he made his way to the door, running a hand over his face to make sure his mask was still in place. What is it? Kakashi asked as he opened the door. Asuma paused at seeing the other Jounin in such disarray: no forehead protector, no Jounin vest, no sandals, rumpled clothes, and hair every which way. Not that the last was that unusual. What are you doing still asleep? Asuma demanded. Haven't you heard about your student? Which one? Kakashi asked with a sigh. Because with his kids, it could be any of them. Which one? Asuma asked incredulously. Sakura, of course. Ino has been demanding that I find her so she and her mother can look after her for a while since she doesn't have anyone else to do it. Kakashi felt the sudden presence of his boys, one at each side. He looked down to find them both glaring at Asuma. What Ino wants doesn't play a factor here, Kakashi said. Only what's best for Sakura. And she has plenty of others who will look after her, Naruto said. She has us, Sasuke said, voice tense and low. Kakashi ended the conversation by shutting the door in Asuma's face. Sakura hadn't been able to make the funeral and memorial arrangements. As it stood, she could barely get out of bed, she was so deep into her grief. Since it had to be done, and sooner rather than later, Kakashi had decided it would be best if he took care of these things for her. He'd left her at his apartment where all 3 of his kids had been staying since they'd heard the news in the care of Naruto and Sasuke. Both of whom were showing remarkable ability to care for their teammate. Kakashi had known they all cared for each other, he'd never questioned that, but he'd had no idea the boys could be so tender and gentle. The Harunos, Kakashi had found, had been the type of people who had planned for everything, including their deaths. When the attorney had approached him with a document specifying their wishes should something like this occur, he'd been enormously relieved. It was on his way back to his apartment after settling the last of the arrangements that Hina stormed up to him, a furious glint in her eye as she was trailed by her father and Asuma. This, he knew, wasn't going to be pretty. Give me Sakura, Ino ordered, voice imperious and furious both. She needs to be taken care of, and I'm not going to let anyone else do it. Kakashi didn't even acknowledge her, instead nodding tightly at Inoki and Asuma in greeting. They simply looked uncomfortable, but didn't appear to be willing to do anything about Ino's behavior. Did you hear me? Ino demanded. Give me Sakura. When he still didn't acknowledge her, she gave a little scream and stomped her foot. Azuma-sensei told me you were difficult, but this is unreal, she said, then turned to Asuma and Inoki. Kakashi watched curiously, wondering what she would do now. Daddy, Azuma-sensei, you always say how Kakashi is nothing but some burned-out old jounin, so make him give me Sakura. He's obviously unfit to take care of her. Kakashi raised an eyebrow and looked to the 2 jounin, both of whom flushed lightly and tried to bluster out some excuse or another. And it was all just too fucking much for him to deal with at the moment. One of his kids was hurting, and he had some little twerp who'd likely never left the safety of Konoha's walls accusing him of being unfit. Well, fuck that. Tell me, little girl, do you know who I am? He asked, squatting down so he was eye level to Ino. Ino blinked. Of course. You're Sakura's sensei. Kakashi agreed. True, true. And, as her jounin sensei, that means that I am now her next of kin until she refiles her paperwork in the ninja registration office. And that means that if you or your father or your sensei try to take her from me, I can have you all arrested and court-martialed. Were you aware of that? Ino just stared at him, mouth agape in clear shock. And believe me, little girl, if anyone tries to take Sakura from me right now, there will be grave consequences indeed. Because what Sakura needs right now are the people who love her, and would do anything for her, and want what is best for her more than anything else. She doesn't need a selfish little girl trying to play at being a grown-up, who wants to be seen taking care of her more than she wants to actually care for her. And Sakura doesn't need to be used as an excuse, and for you to attempt to use her grief as a ploy to get Sasuke's attention disgusts me. Ino stammered. Now wait a second, Hokage, Inoiki tried to interrupt. Kakashi ignored him and continued to speak right over him. But I'm not just Sakura's sensei, he said. Do you know what else I am? Yeah, you're a jounin? Ino offered. And, even though Kakashi's voice had never raised and he hadn't used any chakra or killing intent at all, she was clearly both frightened and entranced by him, caught between taking a step forward or a step back. Kakashi agreed. And I'm something of a legend in the shinobi world, did you know that? I've been inside each and every hidden village in the elemental continent and gotten back out again, and I've been listed in every single bingo book in existence for longer than you've been alive. More than half of those books give the order to immediately retreat upon sighting me, you know, as I've slaughtered entire platoons of enemy nen without any backup. I've spent years in Nanbu, and have accepted more ranked missions than any two Konoha ninja before me combined ever have, and you should know that I have a perfect mission record. That's enough, Kakashi, Asuma said, half facing away. No, I wasn't finished, Kakashi said mildly. I have seniority over both your father and your sensei, both in rank and in years of service to Konoha, little girl, yet both of them are older than I am. I've killed more, bled more, and lost more than either of them. I'm better than them, both individually and combined. And I should tell you, little girl, that if someone tried to take Sakura from me just now, I wouldn't bother being nice enough to let a court-martial go through. No, I'd use every ounce of the skills I've earned to make whoever took her regret it. There was silence at that, as Ino shook, more scared than she'd ever been in her life. Now tell me, little girl, Kakashi said. How are you and your daddy and your sensei going to make me give Sakura to you? Asuma and Inoiki both rapidly recalculated what they knew about Hokage Kakashi even as Ino took one step back, then two. I thought so, Kakashi said, straightening back up and looking to Inoiki and Asuma. I find your indulgence of this girl disgraceful. Just think what might have happened had she acted out against some other jounin who wasn't nearly as nice and easygoing as I am. I hope you take the training of this girl more seriously in the future. Then he disappeared in a swirl of leaves. The memorial service for Sakura's parents was held 2 days later. It was a simple affair, but a fitting homage to the elder Harunos, carried out exactly to their wishes. Sakura still hadn't said a single word. She stood at the service silently, looking as though she were standing by sheer force of will alone. Naruto and Sasuke stood at her side the entire time, hovering like protective bookends with at least one of them holding her at all times. Kakashi understood their concern, and their need to help the only way they knew how. After all, he kept his own post, standing sentry right behind the three of them. When the service was over, Kakashi looked to the crowd of people gathering around to give Sakura their condolences. It wasn't a small crowd, and for all of the times he'd been standing in Sakura's shoes, and it was more often than he ever cared to remember, Kakashi had always thought this was one of the worst parts of the whole thing. He settled a hand on her shoulder to offer what comfort he could, though he knew it wasn't much. A number of civilians who had obviously dealt with the Harunos through their shop all came over in ones and twos, giving soft, gentle words he knew were supposed to offer comfort to Sakura. Kakashi wondered if she found any of them useful. They'd never done anything for him in all the times he'd heard them. Then came Sakura's friends, mostly rookie Jinan or those who had failed out of the program. Ino, he saw, looked up to him in terror before giving Sakura a tight hug and scurrying away. Kakashi would have felt a bit guilty over that had he not seen her cutting her eyes to Sasuke and angling her torso just so to have given Sasuke her best possible angle. Unfortunately for Ino, Sasuke had not been looking. Kakashi had been surprised when Tsunade and Shizune had shown up, and wondered whether the legendary Medicnan had been serious when she'd mentioned taking Sakura on as an apprentice. Her presence at the memorial certainly seemed to indicate that she was. And with Jiraiya trailing behind her, Kakashi knew the old hermit would be putting up a fight to take Naruto, because he couldn't think of any reason other than Naruto that Jiraiya would come to the service. Haruno-san, please accept my sincerest condolences. Kakashi recognized the thin, reedy man with glasses and thinning hair who bowed shallowly to Sakura. I served as your parents' attorney, and I will need to speak with you at some point regarding their will. Sakura, who had remained dry-eyed up to that point, suddenly sniffled. At some point, Kakashi said, cutting the man off from saying more. But not today. The lawyer looked like he was going to protest. Then he caught sight of the look he was getting from Kakashi. And, Kakashi realized, from Naruto and Sasuke, too. The lawyer nodded quickly. "Not today, of course, Jounin Shama," he said. "I just wanted to introduce myself to you and let you know that I am available at your convenience. Again, Haruno-san, I'm very sorry for your loss." He then quickly excused himself. Then everyone was gone except for a young man and an older couple Kakashi assumed to be his parents. As they approached, a sixth sense told him this was going to be trouble. "Ah, Sakura-kun," the young man said, taking Sakura's hand in his. "I'm so sorry, darling. How terrible for this to happen. How sad." Sakura blinked and tilted her head to the side, as though she were seeing what was in front of her for the first time. "I know you're grieving, darling. But I want you to know, my parents and I have discussed it and we've decided that our betrothal will still go forward. So you'll have nothing to worry about. We'll be sure to have the wedding quickly, to help you get over your grief." "Who are you?" Sasuke demanded, even as Naruto pulled Sakura back and away from him. "Me?" the young man asked, putting a hand on his chest. "Why, I'm Haratsubarumo. Sakura-kun's betrothed, of course." "Who are you?" "Sakura's team," Sasuke said curtly. "And as her Junin-sensei," Kakashi cut in. "I am now her guardian and next of kin. So I'll ask you to please address all legal matters, including any betrothal negotiations, exclusively to Clan Hokage, Haratsuzen." Kakashi saw the surprise and dismay writ clear on all of the Haratsu's faces. They wanted Sakura. Likely for her family's business, though Kakashi wasn't enough of a tradesman to understand just how valuable it might be. He just knew they weren't pleased to find Sakura anything but alone and vulnerable. He sometimes hated when his sixth sense was right. Sakura had never been more grateful for her team than she was throughout the funeral and everything that came after. She'd barely been able to feed herself, much less arrange for a memorial service or deal with her parents' will. But she hadn't had to. Her team had quietly taken care of everything for her, and she hadn't been allowed more than an arm's reach away from one of them since she'd been given the news. Sakura was relatively certain that it was only their constant presence that had kept her from falling screaming into a deep abyss and never crawling out again. And now, all that was left were the details. "Basically, they left everything to you," Kakashi told her as they ate dinner in his apartment. That he'd let them all stay with him for so long was just one of the things she was indebted to him for. The day he'd just spent with her parents' attorney without making her go with him was another. "There are only two things you have to make decisions on now, the shop and your betrothal." "My what?" Sakura asked. She noticed Sasuke and Naruto giving Kakashi keen looks. And Kakashi himself looked vaguely uncomfortable. "Haratsubarumo has put a claim in on your parents' estate, saying that he and your parents had reached an agreement that you were to be betrothed," he explained. "But I don't want to be married," Sakura said, eyes going wide as the feelings of panic encroached. "Then I'll take care of it," Kakashi said, voice dark. Sakura didn't want to know how he was going to take care of it, and quite honestly didn't care. All she knew was that she'd kill herself before she married Barumo. "Good," Sasuke said, nodding to Kakashi. "And what about the shop?" "The shop?" Sakura trailed off. I don't want to be a shopkeeper. I'm a kunoichi. But I don't know what to do. I can't get rid of it, they loved that shop so much." She began to weep again. "Maybe it would be better for me to marry Barumo after all. Then he could take care of the shop and... You're not marrying anyone," Kakashi said firmly. "And don't worry about the shop, Sakura-kun," Naruto said, "I'll take care of it." "But you're a shinobi, not a shopkeeper," she said. Naruto grinned. "Ah, but you forget, Sakura-kun," he said. "I wasn't always a shinobi. And I know people who aren't shinobi. Just trust me." She nodded, too grateful she didn't have to make any decisions at all to question things too heavily. It hadn't been difficult for Kakashi to find where the Haratsu family lived. They were, after all, just civilians while he was an elite jounin of Konoha. And he thought dealing with the betrothal issue promptly would be for the best. So it was that first thing the morning after discussing it with Sakura that Kakashi was knocking on their front door. A servant answered, bowing to him. "Good morning, Shinobi-sama," the girl said. "How might this one be of service?" And he was promptly shown in and asked to wait for the Haratsus in their handsomely furnished receiving room. When they made him wait an entire half-hour, he knew that they didn't care what he had to say, that they were the type who thought they'd get their way no matter what. He'd dealt with their kind before and knew this wouldn't go away quickly or easily. Kakashi felt a headache coming on. "Ah, Hatake-san," Barumo greeted as he wandered in, his parents in tow. "How nice that you were able to stop by to see us." "I am here in my role as Haruno Sakura's guardian," Kakashi said formally, addressing himself to the patriarch of the family as was proper in these circumstances. Haruno-san is not seeking a husband at this time, and while honored by your offer, is unable to accept. Three Jaws went slack at his pronouncement. I know Sakura is young, the patriarch said. But her father and I had a number of serious discussions about the future. We had agreed on the dowry and the bride price, and all that was left was to sign the documents. Sakura and Buruma were to be betrothed until she was old enough to properly marry. And by that, Kakashi knew he meant old enough to safely bear an heir. He found himself wanting to make sure that neither Haratsu man was ever able to create an heir again. I'm willing to abide by that agreement still if she would like time, the elder Haratsu continued, unaware of the violent bent of Kakashi's thoughts, but it's best for her not to be worried about her future. She's just a little girl, after all. She is a kunoichi, Kakashi disagreed. And she is my ward. We have discussed her future, and it has been decided that Haruno-san is not seeking a husband at this time. There will be no betrothal, Haratsu-san. I had a deal with Haruno-san. You can't do this. I can, Kakashi corrected. Haruno-san was very thorough, and sent his attorney a copy of the notice breaking off their negotiations with you, Haratsu-san. As Sakura is not seeking a husband, I see no need to begin the negotiations anew. Buruma turned red. Listen here, you thug, Buruma said, storming over to him. If you know what's good for you, you'll hand over the little twit. Kakashi just raised an eyebrow, wondering if he was supposed to be intimidated. Maybe if the boy didn't look as soft as a newborn, he might have been mildly concerned. Then again, no. Do you know who you're dealing with? Buruma demanded, throwing his hands out and shoving Kakashi back. Well, try to, anyway. Kakashi just tilted his head to the side. I'm curious, Haratsu-san, Kakashi replied. Do you know who you're dealing with? Buruma lifted his hands to shove him again, but Kakashi raised his own hand in warning. I allowed your first assault, and am willing to let it slide, given what I am sure is your extreme disappointment in finding your tentative betrothal is no more. Kakashi's tone of voice made it clear just what he thought of both the assault and Buruma's disappointment. But think carefully before you take that next step, Haratsu-san. I will not be so forgiving of another attack on my person. Buruma's face turned even darker red, and Kakashi was sure it was only his father's order to sit down along with his mother physically taking his hand that prevented Buruma from trying to kill him. Kakashi thought it rather a shame Buruma hadn't tried. Because he was sure these people were snakes in the grass, and that they would come back time and again until they either got what they wanted or were defanged. And an assault on a Konoha shinobi would go a long way towards that defanging. It had been close to a week since the funeral. Kakashi hadn't been at all surprised that Sakura hadn't made any noises about returning home, but that neither Sasuke nor Naruto had was certainly curious. Instead, they were all three still camped out in his tiny, one-bedroom apartment. And, while he did admit that it was a bit of a relief to have all three of his kids together in one place where he could keep an eye on them, he also had to be honest enough, at least to himself, to admit that it was disconcerting to have his space invaded and completely taken over by his kids. Kakashi had been living alone since age 6 and was well and truly set in his ways, after all. But, watching them as they continued the conditioning regime he'd set up for them, listening to their friendly banter, Kakashi found he couldn't bring himself to even think about suggesting they leave. They all seemed so much better together, when they had each other to lean on and support. And, really, they were all still so fragile. Sakura was still desperately grieving for her parents, and lived in something of a zombie-like state whenever the boys weren't distracting her. Sasuke had been an obsessive disaster waiting to happen since Itachi had killed his clan, and while his downward spiral into insanity had stopped, Kakashi was under no illusions that he wouldn't still be raising major red flags on his next psychoval. And Naruto. Naruto somehow thought he was a prostitute's child, had far too many contacts with the Yakuza, and had an inferiority complex so large and so deeply ingrained that he was certain he'd never even make Chunin and, somehow, had been able to hide all of it well enough that Kakashi hadn't even noticed until Naruto had practically hit him over the head with it. And yet, somehow, they all fit together. Kakashi motioned with his hand for them to start sparring as they finished the last of the exercises he'd set them on. Then he sighed and laid on his back, stretching his legs out and closing his eyes as he tried to think of ways to make his kids whole again as he listened to the sounds of their sparring and the light banter of their exchanges. They really were better when they were together. Sakura would smile sometimes. And Sasuke would allow himself to relax the tiniest bit. And Naruto seemed calmer, and somehow more whole. And with the three of them all living together, the effects were only amplified. So no, he couldn't ask them to leave. which left him with the dilemma of 4 people all living in his tiny one-bedroom apartment. Sleeping on the job, Kakashi? Kurenai asked, clear disapproval in her tone. Really, they deserve the benefit of your full attention, such as it is. If you accept a Jonin team, they need to be your priority. Kakashi only grunted, annoyed that she was there at all, much less that she, a newly minted Jounin, thought she could lecture him. I know you're supposed to be legendary, she lectured, annoying him even further. Because while he didn't care what others thought, the constant doubting of his abilities he'd run into lately was frustrating. He supposed he'd have to do something about Danzo's rumors after all. But you can't just ignore them and expect them to somehow learn. They're your responsibility now, and you have to start acting like it. Kurenai, Kakashi said without opening his eyes or sitting up. Go away. And get back to work, kids. They had been far too quiet and had gotten much too close for Kakashi to believe they were still sparring seriously instead of listening in on his conversation. Ni, Kaka-sensei, Sakura said, playing up the little girl role. Can't we take a break? And she threw herself down next to him, laying her head on his stomach even as Sasuke sat against him and used his bent legs as a backrest. He didn't miss that they'd placed themselves between him and Kurenai. Or that Naruto stood just behind them, loose and ready just in case he was needed. It was cute, he decided, that they so clearly wanted to protect him. They really were good kids. Kakashi, I need to speak with you, Kurenai said, interrupting his thoughts. Alone. He refrained from sighing. Lake, he told the kids. They all groaned. But Kaka-sensei, Sakura pouted. Do we have to? Naruto asked. Go, Kakashi told them. DCH, Sasuke sniffed in annoyance. How many? I'll tell you when you can stop. They all groaned some more, then got up and headed off to the lake at a jog. He'd rescue them from their laps in a while. No more than an hour. Or 2. He sat up and finally opened his eye, glancing at Kurenai only to find her looking very displeased. Well? He prompted her. They're turning 13 this year, she said. Which means you'll have to start teaching them about bodywork missions. To call it a bodywork mission was the polite way of discussing a mission where sex was involved. He wasn't surprised Kurenai used the polite terminology. Hot as she was also ridiculously prim and proper. And? He asked. And, I wanted to make sure Sakura was given all the tools she needs. Kurenai crossed her arms in front of her chest as she leaned against a tree. I don't want to see a kunoichi get herself into trouble because she was set out without the proper training. Kakashi raised an eyebrow at her. Look, she said, frustrated. I just wanted to tell you that I'll train her for this, and sometime next month, I'll be taking her for a week or 2 for it. Have you ever been on a lipstick mission? Kakashi asked, using the term most kunoichi put to sexually related missions. Kurenai flushed and began to protest his asking. No, I didn't think so. For all that he does his best to be fair and even, the Hokage does know that Asuma has had his eye on you for years now. Her face turned a deep red at that. That has nothing to do with... It has everything to do with this, as I would never leave my team to be trained by an inexperienced instructor. I can take care of training my own team, and will do so when and how I see fit, Kakashi said, cutting her off. You'll not take Sakura next week. And you will not make plans to take any of my Jonin without my permission again. She looked like she was going to protest. Dismissed, Kurenai, he said pointedly. She turned on her heel and left. Kakashi still wasn't sure how, when it was his apartment, somehow the kids had taken over his bed and he'd been relegated to the couch. But as he watched over them, he couldn't help but smile just a bit at how, curled up together as they were, they looked like nothing so much as a pile of puppies exhausted from a hard day of playing. Of course, in their case, playing meant intense training. But Kakashi wasn't sure how else to make sure they would all be able to sleep. All of his kids were haunted by enough to keep anyone up at night, so he continued to train them into exhaustion day after day, in hopes of helping them take their minds off of it. It had worked for him. Well, mostly, anyway. Sometimes. Occasionally. So alright, Kakashi decided, I'll have to come up with something better for them. Naruto shifted in his sleep, unable to keep still even while unconscious, and Sasuke's elbow shoved into Naruto's ribs in a way Kakashi thought looked very uncomfortable even as Sakura clung to the blonde a little tighter. Kakashi shook his head and headed to the couch with the threadbare blanket and old, dilapidated pillow. He pursed his lips as he considered the situation. Napping on the old couch every once in a while was fine, but it wasn't a substitute for his bed. The lumps were starting to make his back ache, and he was too tall, leaving his feet to stick off the end. Which meant the blanket always slipped, And he woke up every morning with freezing feet. Kakashi hated having cold feet. He sighed as he settled in for another uncomfortable night. They couldn't all continue living in his tiny apartment. Hell, the place was barely livable for one old bachelor. And he couldn't send the kids off to live by themselves again. He knew firsthand how much that messed with your mind to be on your own at such a young age. They couldn't stay. And they couldn't go. Which, he realized, really left them only one option. He sighed again, this time in distress. The things he did for his kids. Ohio-san, Kakashi said, waking them with a cheeriness he was certain sounded as forced as it felt. Today we have a most dangerous mission assigned to us. Indeed, we shall be risking life, limb, and our very sanity by tackling such a thing. Oh, no, Sakura put her hands over her face as Naruto groaned and Sasuke sighed heavily. Drank mission, restore an abandoned clan house, Kakashi said, heartened by their obvious suffering. They all groaned in dismay, then rolled out of the bed and began getting ready. He tossed them each a granola bar and a banana and the kids began trudging along after him, still rubbing the sleep out of their eyes as he led them away from the more populated section of Konoha into one of the older neighborhoods. The streets there were narrow, and the houses lining them all larger family homes built in the old, traditional style were all set back far enough from the road that privacy was guaranteed. This district had no apartment buildings, no shops, no restaurants, just old clan-style homes. It seemed far too soon, but there they were, turning down a lane that he hadn't walked on in almost 20 years. He cursed himself silently when he saw his kids had picked up on his sudden tensing, causing them to come alert and move slightly apart from each other so as not to create too large a target and give themselves room to maneuver. In other circumstances, Kakashi would be pleased they did such a thing so automatically. Now, he was just annoyed. Ma, just bad memories, he said, signing to them to stand down. He could practically feel their stares burning into the back of his head. Then they were at the stone pathway that led from the street to his old family house. He had a flashback of himself as a little kid, running down the path to greet his father as he came home from a mission, then jumping into his arms and riding on his shoulders back to the house where his mother was waiting. He shook his head to clear it, and began down the path at a brisk pace. Sensei, Sakura asked hesitantly, tugging on his sleeve a bit, are you sure? That is everything alright? Fine, he said, patting her head dismissively even as he silently berated himself for not making a solo trip first to clear out any old ghosts he might have. He quickly strode up to the door and sliced his thumb, smearing it over the seal the fourth had placed on the house for him. Wait, Naruto said, eyeing the seal in a way Kakashi decided had far too much interest. So he quickly performed the simple dispelling seal the fourth had taught him to remove the preservation seal. Then he looked up to see Naruto watching him, probably knowing quite a bit more than Kakashi would prefer just from his short glimpse at the seals. But he didn't ask questions, for which Kakashi was grateful. Come on, he said, waving to them to follow him into the house. So, what exactly are we here for again? Sasuke asked, looking around. We're cleaning it out, Kakashi said. And the guy who used to live here was a paranoid little bastard, so you can think of dealing with all of the traps as a sort of training. He grinned as they groaned again. Then he opened the door and led them inside. As they looked around, even Kakashi was surprised by the simultaneous state of disarray and tidiness tucked away inside the house. Pieces of furniture were still shoved out of the way, exactly where he'd pushed them so he could train inside the house when his sensei had demanded he go home, and at least half of it was destroyed as a result of that training. There were various dishes that were still piled in the sink, remnants of food still caked onto them. And he had to wonder what his bedroom was like. But there wasn't more than a fine layer of dust coating anything, probably the same dust that had been there when Minato-sensei had sealed the house. How long has this place been abandoned? Naruto asked, and Kakashi forced himself out of his fog. Oh, about 20 years, Kakashi answered. He noticed the appraising look Naruto was giving the place and wondered what else he had managed to pick up. The boy really was much more observant than most people ever gave him credit for, but just now, Kakashi wished he'd turn it off. Bull, Sasuke said, much to all of their surprise. I've seen houses that have been abandoned for years, and this doesn't look like any I've ever seen. The seal Kaka-sensei broke was for more than security, Naruto said. I couldn't get much more of a read on it than that it had an element of preservation in it, but I did manage to catch that before Kaka-sensei broke it. Kakashi ignored Naruto's accusing glare. Can you put one on another clan house? Sasuke asked Kakashi, who belatedly realized what abandoned houses he'd visited and why, exactly, they'd been abandoned. I don't know enough about the seal to recreate it, Kakashi admitted. He was a bit disconcerted when Sasuke immediately shrugged and turned to Naruto. "I didn't see much of it," Naruto hedged, closing his eyes to try to dredge up an image of it from the brief glimpse he'd gotten. "I'll do what I can." "Not right now, you won't," Kakashi said, glancing to Sakura, who still hadn't said a word. "People will be moving in shortly, so we need to get it back into shape as best we can as quickly as we can. So get moving." He supposed that he hadn't been in much shape to do much housekeeping after his mother had died, but he hadn't realized he'd been this bad. Some areas were as pristine as they'd ever been while his mother was alive. Other areas looked as though they'd been invaded by filth. He could see why the fourth had made him move. Looking back, he'd obviously been self-destructing. And honestly, he couldn't quite pinpoint when he'd stopped. He found himself alone in a room with Naruto, who was looking at him with eyes that were far too old. "This was your home, wasn't it?" Naruto said quietly. Kakashi scratched the back of his head sheepishly. "What gave it away?" he asked. Naruto shrugged. "So you're moving back in?" he asked instead. "Ah, well, that is. I'd hoped to tell the three of you all at once," Kakashi said. Naruto nodded, as though that made sense to him. "I'm used to being on my own," Naruto said. "I'm going to try to. For that matter, Sasuke is, too, but he never really adapted, since he had family for the first half of his life. And he depends on you more than I think you realize," Naruto continued without allowing Kakashi to finish. "And as for Sakura, I think you know how ill-suited she is to being on her own." Kakashi nodded. These were some of the exact reasons he'd made the decision he had. "So I want you to promise me you won't abandon them when the baby comes." Kakashi blinked. "The baby?" he asked. Naruto cocked his head to the side. "Isn't that why you're doing this?" Naruto asked. "I heard a rumor about a girl I'd heard you were seeing. That she'd gotten in trouble? Isn't that why you're moving back into your old home? To move her in here to raise your kid?" "My kid," Kakashi said, stunned and more than a little confused and dazed. Look, I think you have the wrong idea here, Naruto. I haven't seen that girl any girl in, well, since I got you guys as a team." Kakashi considered that and decided that this was a situation he would have to rectify. He'd been without for longer in the past, but it had usually involved long-term missions. "If she's in trouble, the kid isn't mine." It was Naruto's turn to blink in surprise. "Oh," he said. "So, whatever you were thinking was going to happen with this house? That isn't it," Kakashi said. "And even if it was, do you really think I'd abandon the three of you?" Naruto only cocked his head to the side, and Kakashi realized that the confusion from Wave hadn't done his sense of belonging any good. "You're mine, Naruto," Kakashi said with a sigh, tugging Naruto closer and petting the back of his neck. "For better or for worse, you're mine. Now go help Sasuke with the next room." Naruto eyed him for another few moments, then tucked his face into Kakashi's side and clutched one hand onto his vest in a fleeting imitation of a hug, then nodded and disappeared. Kakashi rubbed his forehead, wondering if he truly understood what it was he was getting into and decided he likely didn't. But, he thought as he looked around the remnants of his father's old room, he could probably safely say he wasn't self-destructing anymore. Probably. When they'd finished hauling out all of the furniture that was broken beyond repair and cleaning up all of the various little messes Kakashi had left before Minato-sensei had dragged him out of the house all but kicking and screaming, the kids turned to him for direction. "Let's sit," he said, suddenly nervous. He sat on the spot, right on the ground, not even bothering to find a chair that hadn't been scrapped. The kids shrugged and did the same. "This place." Kakashi trailed off, running a hand through his hair and uncertain how to say what he wanted to say. Words had never been his strong point. Give him a kunai and he could do just about anything asked of him in seconds. But feelings and emotions, and may the will of fire help him, explaining theme were a big giant gaping black pits he'd always glossed over and avoided when at all possible. And Kakashi often made a point of making it possible. "This used to be my house," he spit out. Then he shook his head. "Is my house. It's my clan home." He let out a breath, frustrated at himself. Then he looked to his kids, none of whom looked particularly surprised. "You knew?" They all nodded and he cocked his head, silently asking for an explanation. "The seal," Naruto said with a shrug, which Kakashi had already known. "I cleaned up a few of your special shirts with the masks in them," Sakura explained. "I can't believe you wore them even when you were that little. It was listed on a map of all the clan compounds in my father's den." Sasuke refused to look at him, but Kakashi understood. Both the shame of going through your dead father's things and the embarrassment of being caught out looking for information on your sensei. He'd done both, too, once upon a time. Right, he said. Well, then. Here's the thing. I can't deal with cold feet anymore. They all looked at him like he'd gone a little bit crazy. He wasn't sure they weren't right. He shook his head, clearing it so he could put words together in a way that other people might actually be able to make sense of. What I mean is, my apartment is too small. We should move here, instead. There was dead silence at that pronouncement. Look, it's big enough, and you can each have your own bedroom, and I'm not saying you should give up your other places, but this way. He was cut off when Sakura dove at him, settling against his chest and gripping him tightly enough he absently realized the conditioning he'd set her was working. "Thank you, sensei," she said, voice a bit muffled by his vest. He looked up to the boys to see what they thought, to find them both looking poleaxed, but not necessarily opposed. He decided to move to make it final before they thought to object. "Let's pick out your rooms," he said, standing and hoisting Sakura onto his back. The boys didn't move, still trying to make sense of what was going on. He understood. The idea of living with other people after being on your own for so long was one that would take some getting used to. He was still rather iffy on the idea himself. Not that he'd tell them that, of course. Instead he bent and scooped both boys up, one under each arm, and dragged all three of his kids through the house to find their rooms. Of course, they immediately began squirming to get away, but Kakashi just shifted his grip to keep hold and ignored their increasingly loud and dangerous, if he hadn't been a jounin, protests of the treatment. Then Sakura began giggling. And he relaxed. Because even if this wasn't exactly the conventional thing to do, for them it was just right. Most days, the Hokage wished he could order Danzo killed. On days like this, he wished he could do it himself. It was enough that he had to contend with Danzo spreading ridiculous rumors that a 27-year-old shinobi was somehow past his prime. And that it didn't appear to the rest of the village that the rumors had been instigated by Danzo's jealousy only made it more exasperating, as it meant the rumors were likely working. And now there was this to deal with, too. The Hokage frowned again as he looked at the paperwork in front of him. He now had 3 complaints from current Junin-sensei regarding one Hatake Kakashi and the training and care of his team. The complaints listed seemed at odds with what he himself had observed, but he supposed it was possible they had seen things he hadn't. Highly unlikely, but possible. Nevertheless, with 3 complaints it was required that he look further into the allegations, an old mechanism put in place when Konoha had first started using Junin-sensei to teach ninja outside the traditional clan setting in order to protect clan children from being exploited, ignored, or having their techniques stolen by jealous non-clan or rival clan jounin. Which was why he'd called Kakashi to his office to discuss it with him. No matter how much it annoyed him that he had to do it. He had plans for Kakashi, damn it all, even if the boy was being stubborn at the moment, and doubts about his fitness as a Junin-sensei certainly didn't fit into them. When there was a knock at his door he was annoyed by the interruption. It was only 15 minutes after the meeting he'd summoned Kakashi to, which meant it certainly wouldn't be him, and the Hokage didn't want to deal with anything that might cause his meeting with Kakashi to be further delayed or interrupted. So when Kakashi was announced by his Anbu, the Hokage was both surprised and pleased. Being a Jounin-sensei had apparently done more for Kakashi than he'd realized. "Hokage-sama," Kakashi said, giving an appropriate bow then standing at his relaxed version of attention. "Sit," the Hokage told him, motioning to the chair across from him. "I have received 3 reports detailing concerns about your teaching methods." He watched Kakashi's reaction carefully. Because, even though he wore a mask and his forehead protector covered one eye, if you knew what to look for you could still see hints of his reaction. "May I know who filed the reports?" Kakashi asked. The Hokage didn't reply, which was an answer in and of itself. Because Kakashi hadn't had even a hint of a reaction in his body language. In a shinobi as experienced and well-trained as Kakashi, the Hokage knew that meant either absolute fury or complete indifference. The Hokage knew which one he was betting on. Well, perhaps you won't mind my musing aloud," Kakashi said. "Kurenai would likely be most recent, after I informed her it was unacceptable to me for her to train Sakura in bodywork missions next month. Then, Asuma. A few weeks back. Most probably in response to the dressing down I gave as Jinan. And the third? Kakashi tapped his fingers against his thigh as his mind worked. Guys most likely, Kakashi said. Though I'd expect that report too had been made a few months ago, if it were him. The Hokage remained silent as he was reminded yet again why Kakashi had been considered a genius and one of Konoha's most elite shinobi for so long. He wasn't sure there were any other shinobi in the village who could have made such quick and accurate deductions from such little information. And, he knew, his lack of protest only confirmed for Kakashi that his guesses had been correct. He took a mental note to keep those 3 jounin out of rotation for foreign missions until Kakashi had finished his revenge. He didn't want injured shinobi in the field, after all, and by making them sitting ducks for Kakashi, he also managed to satisfy his own petty desire for reprisal on the 3. Weak of him, he knew, but even the Hokage was only a man. And this additional hit to Kakashi's reputation annoyed him. It was not good to be the ninja who annoyed the Hokage. From what I have seen, I am ready to dismiss all of these reports, the Hokage said, and saw a minute relaxation of Kakashi's shoulders at his words. But protocol must be followed, so you may submit your formal reply to the complaints to me in writing by the end of the day. If there's to be an inquiry, Kakashi said, I would like to request that the kids be kept out of it as much as you can. You know that won't be possible. They don't deserve to be dragged into the middle of this. Neither do you, the Hokage said, clearly surprising Kakashi. But then, it was the truth. If not for his needing a successor, Danzo's attention would never have fallen on the boy. If not for that, rumors about his abilities would never have been spread, and, if not for those rumors, the Hokage had no doubts that nobody would have even thought to question his teaching methods. So really, the whole mess could be put squarely on Minato's shoulders. The Sundaime had never been so angry as he'd been when he'd found what the 4th had done. It was fortunate for Minato indeed that he was already dead when Sarutobi had been told. Team 7 will report to Shiranui Genma until the inquiry is complete. You are not to have contact with them until then. Ano, Hokage-sama, Kakashi said, scratching the back of his head. You know they're all living with me, right? The Hokage blinked in surprise. Then his mouth twitched, and he couldn't help but start laughing. When Genma showed up later that day to meet Team 7 instead of Kakashi, they were not amused. When he told them they were to report to him until further notice, they were furious. They had been nominally concerned when he hadn't come home the night before, but he was a jounin, and Kakashi had a habit of staying out on occasion. Sakura had once asked the boys what they thought he did on his nights out, but the looks she'd gotten from them in response made sure she'd never asked again. Where is Sensei? Sakura demanded. Sasuke slid off the branch he'd been lazing on as they'd waited for Kakashi even as Naruto slid into place next to her. Look, Genma said to them. This isn't my idea of a fun deal, either. I sure didn't want to get stuck babysitting a bunch of brats, or have my missions cut so I could. But orders are orders, so we all get to deal with it. Team 7 glanced at each other, nodding in agreement. Where is Sensei? Sakura repeated her demand, not in the least deterred. Above my pay grade, Genma said with a shrug. Now let's start with some conditioning. Let's start with you telling us what the fuck is really going on, Naruto said. Look, I'm just here to fill in until Hatake's back, alright? Genma was clearly annoyed. That was fine with Sakura, she rather thought she and the rest of Team 7 were likely even more annoyed by this whole thing. Not alright, Sasuke said. And not all you're here for. Tell us what's going on, or we'll find out on our own. DCH, good luck with that. Genma snorted. Orders on this came straight from the Hokage's office. I'd like to see you get through that security. When he saw the contemplative looks on their faces, he thought that perhaps that hadn't been the best way to phrase it. When he caught their hand sign zones that vaguely reminded him of his Anbu days but which made no sense at all, he began to worry. Because no matter how long ago Kakashi's glory days had been, there was a reason he was a legend. And there was no telling what he might have passed along to his Jinan. It took them 5 minutes of sparring to get Genma to dismiss them for the day. Surprisingly, it had been Sakura who had disabled him. And then proceeded to look so innocent that butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. I'm so sorry, Genma-sensei, she pouted, twisting her hair around her finger in apparent dismay. Why can't I feel my legs? Genma asked, sounding dazed. Ano, Genma-sensei, I'm learning about medical jutsu, but I'm just a Jinan so I don't know much. Sakura bit her lip. I didn't realize you wouldn't be able to move in time. Kakashi-sensei is so fast I forget sometimes that not all jounin can move like him. Naruto ducked behind Sasuke to keep Genma from seeing him sniggering. You used a medical technique on me? I tried to, Genma-sensei, Sakura said, nodding earnestly. But I guess I didn't get it all the way right. I sometimes do that, but I'm getting better. Really? I'm sure you'll be fine, Sasuke said dismissively. She once burned my eyebrows off, but they grew back. Eventually. That was a long time ago. Sakura protested, stamping her foot. Then she reached forward, hands glowing green with medical chakra. There's no way I would make that mistake again. Now here, let me see whether I can fix this or not. No. Genma used his arms to scoot out of the way faster than he'd thought possible. Genma-sensei, don't you want me to try to help you? Sakura's bottom lip was quivering, and if Naruto didn't know her better, he'd have thought she was truly distraught. As it was, he was quite proud of her little con. I'm the one who messed up the technique so badly that you can't feel your legs anymore. If you never regain feeling in them, I'll just be devastated. Won't you let me help? Ah ha ha, Genma laughed nervously. How about you practice on your teammates? Or a dead fish or something? I'm just going to go to the hospital for a little while. Dismissed. And with a flash of smoke, Genma used a shunshine to disappear. Sakura's distraught expression disappeared equally quickly. Pussy, she muttered. Sasuke choked on his spit as Naruto used him to keep himself from collapsing with the laughter he smothered into Sasuke's shoulder. Sasuke gave him an elbow jab and he fell to the ground with an oomph. Naruto's foot meeting his thigh meant Sasuke followed him shortly after. Sakura sighed as she watched the boys tumble around on the ground. Please continue if you want to follow Genma to the hospital, she said, voice as sweet as could be. The boys froze, looked to each other, then tackled her. Hey! She protested, laughing even as they dragged her into their impromptu wrestling match. A few minutes later, panting and out of breath, they came to an unspoken truce. Then Sakura smacked both of them upside the head and got up. Now let's go find Kakashi-sensei. 3 hours into their fruitless search for their errant sensei, Naruto found himself the center of a bit of unwanted attention. Naruto, I think you have an admirer, Sakura teased, nudging him with her elbow. Naruto didn't need to look behind him to know that it was the female Junon they'd saved in Wave. She'd been following him at least part of almost every day they'd been back in Konoha. He found it more than a little disconcerting, but had thus far been managing to ignore it. He grunted as his eyes passed over the Junon. She appeared to have brought a friend with her this time. I think they're spawning, Naruto said incredulously. Yeah, Sasuke sighed, shoulders drooping a bit. They do that. And for the first time, he thought he understood Sasuke's fervent dislike of his fangirls. Because as inept as she was at following him, Naruto thought the girl's time would be much better spent training in just about anything. Even I wasn't that bad, Sakura said, eyeing the Junon in distaste. At the silence that greeted that statement, Sakura turned to her teammates, hands on her hips. Sasuke looked at her skeptically. What? I wasn't, Sakura insisted. Naruto, back me up here. Ah ha ha, Naruto laughed, desperately holding his hands up to protest his innocence. There is no possible way for me to respond to this situation that would result in any positive outcome for me. He bit his lip. Can I take a pass? Sakura and Sasuke both huffed in annoyance. Well, Ino was 10 times worse, anyway, Sakura sniffed. Sasuke made a sound that someone who didn't know him as well would have missed, but that his teammates easily read as agreement. And speaking of, Sasuke muttered, tilting his head to indicate Ino's imminent collision with them. Naruto scrunched up his nose in distaste. Ino had always been a gossip queen, and had never wanted anything to do with him. Then he realized that, in their current situation, that could make her incredibly useful. It's Konoha's resident gossip monger, Naruto said, laughing brashly. What? Ino cocked her head to the side, and Naruto could almost see the steam coming out of her ears. There's the hook, he thought. The girl who knows everything that's anything in the village, or at least makes it up if she doesn't, he continued. Now that isn't true, and you know it, Ino protested. Oh no? Naruto asked. Well, Sasuke, she doesn't know. See, I told you she'd be no help. And that's the line. Ino cut her eyes to Sasuke and gave her lashes a bat or two. Well, you know, I do know a lot about what's going on in the village, she said, then turned back to Naruto with much less sweetness displayed in her expression. But I don't make anything up. Nah, I don't believe it, Naruto said, scrunching up his nose. If you knew everything, you'd know what happened to Kakashi-sensei, after all, and we don't even know that. A gleam came into Ino's eye. Oh really? She said archly, glancing to Sasuke. Naruto kicked him, trying to get him to play along, or at least grunt in his uncommunicative bastardish kind of way, but instead he just raised an eyebrow at him. Luckily, Ino thought it was directed at her and threw her shoulders back proudly. And, sinker. Score. Well, it just so happens that you're talking to one of the only people in all of Konoha who might know anything, she gushed, wanting to please Sasuke. Naruto almost felt bad about manipulating her into it, but she made it so easy he decided that, as a fellow Junon, it was practically his duty to help her toughen up a bit. Really? And Sasuke-kun, if you really want to know, I'll tell you. He's under review for negligence and dereliction of his duties as a Jounin sensei. She eagerly spilled her guts, completely missing the shock her audience felt at her words. It's all very hush-hush, even if everyone knows how horrible he is to all of you. The only reason I know about it is because my sensei filed one of the complaints and told me about it, because that Kakashi was just so horrible and mean to me when I was so worried about Sakura-kun after her parents, well, you know. So with any luck, he'll be dismissed as your sensei, and you'll all get reassigned. Wouldn't that be great, Sasuke-kun? Then maybe you could be on my team instead of with Forehead Girl or the Dead Last. Even while preening under the thought of having done what her rival for Sasuke couldn't, Ino didn't miss the look of staggered looks on all three of her classmates' faces. Well, what's wrong with you? I thought you'd be happy to get rid of such an old burnout of a Jounin for your sensei, Ino said, unsure of what had gone wrong. Because team looked like they'd been sucker punched. She pursed her lips, deciding she was going to get to the bottom of it, but before she could even open her mouth, Naruto had cocked his head to one side, Sasuke grunted, and Sakura nodded, and they all disappeared in a swirl of leaves. Hey, wait, she said, blinking at the use of the advanced technique. How'd you do that? Azuma-sensei hasn't taught us how to do that yet. After hearing Ino's news, Team 7 had made a strategic fall back to one of their spots, in this case, the rooftop of a building that was roughly midway between most of their favorite food joints and, more importantly, had three separate peaks to it and an unusual configuration of the drainage spouts that left them a piece of rooftop just large enough for the three of them where they could sit for hours and watch the Shinobi Skyway traffic while remaining completely hidden. They'd sat there in silence for quite a while before Sakura finally broke it. A review, she said, blowing out a hefty sigh. Why in the world would anyone think Kakashi-sensei wasn't doing his job? He's the best sensei ever. Sasuke made a noise of agreement as Naruto picked at his fingers nervously. Well, I guess I can't say ever, Sakura rattled on. I haven't known all of them ever, but I can say without any bias at all that Kakashi-sensei is by far the most capable of all of the Jounin sensei currently serving. She bit her lip and hugged herself. And who would have done this? We have Asuma, but there would need to be two others, Sakura continued. Did they all do it independently? Did they conspire about it first? Was it because of some grudge or something? Naruto let out a little sound of pure distress. And where did Sensei go? Yesterday afternoon, he seemed completely fine, but now he's completely untraceable. Why wouldn't he tell us anything? Or did he not know until after breakfast? When were we going to be told any of this if Genma wasn't going to say anything? Sasuke furrowed his brow in annoyed agreement. Of course, he knew very well that Kakashi was a Jounin and so should be able to evade his detection should he really want to, but Sasuke found it aggravating nonetheless. There's too many questions. Sakura tugged at the ends of her hair, too distraught over everything else to worry about the fact she was trying to break that habit. We need to focus. We should make it a mission, Sasuke said. Sasuke? I don't think the Hokage will let us hire ourselves to investigate why he's reviewing our sensei, Sakura pointed out. Sasuke snorted. I don't know, Naruto might be able to talk him into it. I want you to teach me how you do that, by the way, Sakura said. You're scary enough, Naruto retorted. And besides, if I taught you how, it would never work on you again. Sakura and Sasuke both paused to consider that, then turned baleful stares back at him. That explains so much, Sakura said. Naruto only laughed nervously. We're getting off track. Sakura shook her head. Naruto sagged a bit in relief. Don't think I won't be coming back to this, Naruto, Sakura cautioned, raising her fist to show she was serious. Naruto nodded eagerly, though he began devising future evasions even as he seemed to agree. What did you mean, make it a mission? I meant we should think of it like we do a crank, Sasuke said. Sakura pursed her lips, then nodded. Good idea. We should lay it out for ourselves. Well, all right. A mission then. In that case, what's our primary objective? To kick the ass of everyone involved, Naruto offered hopefully. Sakura snorted as the heel of Sasuke's palm connected with the back of Naruto's head. Objective, return Kakashi to the command of Team 7, Sasuke said. Right, Sakura agreed. Next step, information gathering. What intel do we need? Who instigated the review? How long will it go on? Who's the final arbiter and what factors go into the decision? And how can we influence it? Naruto added. Well, of course, Sakura said. And, maybe most importantly, why was it done in the first place? Because we want to make sure it's never done again. Naruto bit at his thumbnail. Ah, well, there's a possibility that I might know why. he ventured tentatively. Sasuke and Sakura's eyes snapped to him, Sasuke's eyebrow and the tilt of Sakura's head silently demanding answers. So I should maybe preface this by saying this isn't class secret. He looked down as their eyes widened. When I found out, the Hokage specifically forbid me from discussing this with anyone. Well, except him, I guess. Because it's to do with village safety and security. Sasuke looked even more curious as Sakura's eyebrows drew together, clearly trying to figure out what could possibly be going on. Because they all well knew the penalty for disclosing its class secret to unauthorized person's death. Then Naruto dropped the bombshell. The Kyuubi never died that night the fourth fought it. He sealed it away. His voice stumbled then. In me, I mean. Silence met his statement. Naruto didn't blame them, it was a rather shocking statement to make. I always thought the only reason people didn't like me was because, you know, Akasenko, and nobody likes any of us. But after the Junon test, I found out about this, and thought that the Kyuubi thing is probably just as good a reason for people not to like me. But you said it wasn't class secret. How could people know? Sakura pointed out. That wasn't made clear to me. But I think it was only after the secret got out that the Hokage made it a secret? Naruto guessed, glad they hadn't run away screaming. That doesn't make any sense, Sakura pointed out as Sasuke frowned. No, he agreed. Unless the point was to create a rumor that would float to other countries, and our enemies. Naruto scrunched his forehead. That was an angle he hadn't considered. In fact, he realized there was much about this he hadn't considered. You think 3 Junin-sensei dislike you enough because of this that they wrote up complaints on Kakashi-sensei in order to break up our team? I think 3 Junin-sensei hate me enough they do most anything to get me to quit being a shinobi at all, Naruto said. I lost count of the number of times people tried to get me to quit while I was still in the academy. Ridiculous, Sasuke pronounced. Seriously. What jerks? I bet none of them even bothered to know you first, either, Sakura said, clearly disgruntled. Well, it's a good thing you never listened to them, Naruto-kun. And you better not start, either. Naruto let out a shaky breath and a tentative smile. They didn't hate him. They didn't care about the Kyuubi. And Sakura was holding his hand and squeezing it for dear life. He thought he felt something in his hand pop in a way it really shouldn't, but decided that he'd always healed quickly enough in the past that he wouldn't say anything. Naruto never minded Sakura holding his hand. Besides, if he did mention it, Sakura might want to try to heal him. A fate he'd thus far managed to avoid. Sasuke agreed. I want to read those complaints against Sensei. And I want to know who wrote them. Then we'll figure out the why. And then we'll show them the error of their ways. Yeah. And find Kaka-sensei, Sakura added. Naruto was just so glad they weren't upset over the whole Kyuubi thing he just nodded. So where do we start? Kakashi fingered one of the seal strips Naruto had given him months ago. He hadn't had cause to use the onigiri cage bunshine yet, but he found himself considering it. With it, he could ostensibly be an Ipana conducting an investigation into the Haruno Stetson investigation he'd finished with weeks ago after Naruto and Sasuke had convinced him they should send clones to the murder site, and after he'd had the boys dispel themselves. As it hadn't been authorized and he hadn't found anything of note, Kakashi hadn't felt the need to tell the Hokage when he'd assigned the mission to keep him out of Konoha. And away from the kids. He thought about it for a handful of seconds longer before slicing his thumb and smearing the seal with his blood, then forming the ram hand sign to create the clone. A puff of smoke later and he was looking at a perfect replica of himself. It nodded once and headed towards the gate to provide his cover story. Naruto waited, sipping his tea at the small tea house conveniently located near the Hokage's administrative tower. It was a favorite break and snack place for most of the shinobi employed in the tower. And, as such, was a much nicer place than Naruto was used to frequenting. It was also the perfect place to execute their plan to get into the Hokage's tower, so he'd just have to suck it up and deal with it. Because they needed to know what was going on, and where Kakashi-sensei was so they could stop him from being reassigned. And Naruto was determined he wouldn't blow it all by letting on to the other customers that he really wasn't used to places like this. Relax, Sakura murmured, bumping his knee with her own even as she drew lines through the wet circles on the table. It was easy for her to say, he thought. She'd been brought up frequenting these sorts of places. Naruto had grown up being thrown out of them. And the only times he'd visited otherwise, he'd come in the back entrance to do business and had left the same way. You fit in just fine, Sasuke said with a grunt, cutting to the heart of the matter as Naruto pulled at his cuffs again. That hotel in Saijin City was much more extravagant and you didn't have any problems there, right? Sakura pointed out. Of course, in his mind, The two places were very different. The Hajimado Hotel in Saijin City hadn't been run by respectable, decent folks, after all. Sasuke's hand sweeping across the gleaming dark wood of the table forced Naruto's attention back on the task at hand. Sasuke had spotted their mark. He pushed his empty cup to Sakura to refill, using the movement to subtly point their attention in the right direction. Sakura poured Sasuke's refill. "Oops. Empty," she said as it ran out midstream. "I'll be right back." This level of subterfuge probably wasn't necessary as it was unlikely their mark was keeping watch for anything potentially suspect. Man was in the heart of Konoha, sticking to what was obviously a long-held habit. After all, but Kakashi had drilled them mercilessly that bad habits killed good shinobi, so they went with it. Sakura stood with the teapot, off to the counter with it to get a fresh one. Naruto and Sasuke were careful to make it seem they paid her no undue attention, even though they were watching closer than hawks. Naruto couldn't help it when his lips twitched at how deftly Sakura slipped the powder into the teapot destined for their mark's table. Then he smiled fully as Sakura came back to the table with a slight spring in her step. She was obviously pleased with herself, but Naruto didn't blame her. There were few Jonin adept enough to be able to slip something into a Jounin's meal undetected. It was even fewer who could compound a powder tasteless and odorless enough to fool a Jounin. He was facing away from where the Jounin always sat. By design, of course. But then he hadn't realized how boring it would be waiting for Sasuke and Sakura to tell him he was clear. Then Sasuke signaled that their mark had started his first cup of tea, and Naruto started his mental countdown. 10 minutes and he'll need to piss like a racehorse, Sakura had told them, using those exact words. Both of them had choked in surprise at her less than ladylike language. Naruto had even spat out his tea and spilled the rest all over himself. Which was why it was only Sasuke who'd found out 10 minutes later just how well the drug worked. Much to his dismay. So at Sasuke's signal, he began timing back from 10 so he'd move well before their mark, limiting suspicion from falling on them as much as possible. When 8.5 minutes had passed, Naruto excused himself from the table and headed to the restroom. Because the best way to keep someone from realizing you're following him is to get there first. He took his time strolling through the tea house and managed to shut the door behind him just as their target stood. Naruto finished his business and lazily washed his hands, knowing their mark would be getting frantic. Then came the heavy knock on the door. "Oi, you die in there or something?" Naruto opened the door and cocked an eyebrow at him. "All yours, mister." And when he brushed by him in a hurry to use the facilities, Naruto reverse pickpocketed him and slipped a good-sized pebble into his Jounin vest. Which he'd have been able to do without notice even without the laced tea. But the drug did more than act as an extreme diuretic. And the slight dulling of the Jounin's chakra sensory abilities was key to their plan's success. He made his way back to Sasuke and Sakura, and they casually paid and were gone from the tea house before their mark was done taking a leak. Security at the Hokage's administrative tower was understandably tight. Not only were all of the active records housed there, but the Hokage spent most of his time there as well. Either alone would be a choice target for infiltrators, spies, and assassins. But both together made it the highest priority target in all of Konoha. And the Hokage's office was even more carefully guarded. There were dozens of checkpoints and identity screenings done between entering the tower and being shown into the Hokage's suite, all performed by some of Konoha's most talented and skilled shinobi. And there were always plenty of Anbu hanging around, just in case someone failed a checkpoint. Then, even if you could reach the Hokage's office undetected, there were still the dozen Anbu and the Hokage himself to deal with. None of which were likely to take an intruder rifling through his desk lightly. Every single possible way in was under constant monitoring and surveillance, and Team 7 had known it would be futile to try to sneak in using any conventional methods. But as Kakashi had relentlessly drilled them, every security plan had its flaws. The trick was finding a flaw you could exploit. For example, once the Hokage left for the day, his office was sealed shut. Nothing in, nothing out. And no way of disabling it without alerting the Anbu. Normally, this wouldn't be a flaw. Unless you had managed to sneak into the office and hide there undetected until the place had been sealed. Then you'd pretty much have free reign of the office until morning. Of course, even if you did make it in, there was still the matter of finding a way out again. Through doors and windows that couldn't be opened and the dozens of Anbu crawling all over the tower even while the Hokage was away and his office was sealed up. As soon as the seals securing the office activated, the little pebble that had unknowingly fallen out of the pocket of the Hokage's Jounin assistant popped back into a human shape with a sharp breath of relief. He touched his face to make sure his mask was still in place, even though he was certain no one would see him. It was better to be safe than sorry. Still, He desperately wanted to take it off so that he could wipe the sweat from his forehead. Holding himself into a pebble shape for so long had been a lot more difficult than he'd thought it would be. If the old man had stayed for even 20 more minutes. Well, he decided, no use pondering might have beans. He took out 2 seal strips, already active and coated in his blood, and used them to summon an odd bunch of Sasuke and Sakura, both as masked and covered as Naruto was. Sakura immediately turned to him and hugged him. "I was worried," she whispered. Even Sasuke grunted. Naruto grinned sheepishly and went to stand watch, listening for any hint that someone might be coming and glad that his part in all of this was over. Because Sasuke and Sakura, he knew, had the hard part of actually finding what they were looking for. Naruto read far too slowly to be of any real help, so he'd been set to watching and listening, making sure nobody was coming back. He crouched in front of the door and began examining the ceiling structure as he waited. It was a good thing they had time, because even with both of them looking it had taken a full 2 hours before they made any progress at all. "I've found our second objective," Sasuke called to them. "Good, then you can start helping me look for the first," Sakura said, not even bothering to look up from her stack. Naruto saw Sasuke's eyes flash with the Sharingan as he memorized the papers in front of him, then carefully returned it all exactly as he'd found it. "Never mind," Sakura said. "Here it is." She paged through it, speed-reading the material. Naruto shook his head, knowing he'd never be able to read anything so quickly, much less memorize it. Sasuke glanced through the pages with his Sharingan, then they both nodded they were through with it. It took them a handful of moments longer to clean Sakura's stack of papers up again, then they looked around the room to make sure nothing was out of place. "Ready?" Naruto asked. They nodded, and then they all three dispelled themselves with small puffs of smoke. Kage Bunshin, after all, didn't need a way out. In theory, any Konoha who found a hole in the village's security was supposed to report it to the High Jounin. Kakashi thought that this was generally a good policy and did report things from time to time. In practice, though, Kakashi was one of the best shinobi Konoha had ever produced, and he'd learned long ago that you never knew when you might need a way out of wherever you happened to be, even if it was your own village. So he'd decided that it wasn't necessarily a bad thing to be able to breach your own village's security, so long as you were good enough, anyway. He didn't consider this treasonous of him, just practical. And besides, there were entire departments dedicated to village security. He'd have felt simply awful showing them up all the time. Especially since, as Kakashi was one of the best shinobi Konoha had ever produced, he seriously doubted they'd ever be able to come up with a security system he couldn't bypass, given time. That wasn't to say the security for the Hokage's office was easy to get through. On the contrary, it was one of the most secure places he'd ever seen. Of course, he had had a hand in making it that way, back when he'd had a much more vested interest in the Hokage's security. One of the security precautions in the Hokage's office included an air filtration and ventilation system that was completely cut off from the rest of the building. The idea was that, in the event an enemy managed to set off a gas anywhere else in the tower, the Hokage's office could be sealed off and safe from contamination. The builders had taken care to ensure that the shafts for this secondary ventilation system were small enough that not even a very young child could fit through them. But even if there was a shinobi small enough to crawl them, the grates on either end were slatted with only a quarter inch of space between them, and were held to the wall with seals which would summon the Onbu if broken. They had not been so careful with the tower's regular ventilation system. Given that it had to cover the entire building, the ventilation shafts were much larger, just large enough that Kakashi could slither through them on his belly, so long as he'd removed his Jounin vest and utilities pouches. Kakashi had had the chance to memorize the exact layout of these shafts back when the fourth had been in office and had let him have basically free reign of the tower's security. So he knew exactly where he was going as he inched through the shafts, silently cursing at the bends and determined he would have to increase his flexibility training after this. Crawling through had been much easier when he was still in his teens. He found he was rather indignant over that fact. He wriggled through the last bend with no small relief and felt for the marker he'd left all those years ago. Finally, his fingers brushed over what anyone else would have taken for just a rough piece of metal, but was in fact his indicator that he'd come to the piece of the shaft he'd made certain was slightly smaller than all the others, just small enough that it would slide forward into the next section without trouble. Kakashi stopped and stretched out his senses to make certain nobody was about, then he began the tedious process of unscrewing the shaft and moving it back and out of his way. The downside of having two ventilation systems was that it left a bit of dead space in the walls where they overlapped. And there was just enough of it that Kakashi was able to contort his torso so he was dangling down over the secondary vent that went directly into the Hokage's office. Though there seemed to be much less space than there had been 10 years ago. He consoled himself that it had to be due to increased muscle mass instead of the increased sake intake. Though the builders and the security teams had been very careful to keep the grate attached and sealed to the wall, they hadn't bothered to seal the shaft to the grate. Likely, the thought had been that the seals keeping the grate and the wall in one piece were more than sufficient, especially since there was no way anyone could get through the tiny shafts anyway. Kakashi had thought this ridiculously sloppy, as with a direct line of sight a talented shinobi could use any number of jutsu, but when he'd discussed it with the fourth, he'd just ruffled his hair and been told that nobody would be able to get that far without detection. The following day, Kakashi had set off a smoke bomb when Sensei had been alone in his office, and he'd suddenly been taken much more seriously. Of course, before they could do anything about it, the fox had come. Kakashi was only just now getting around to forgiving the third and fourth both for his death, so the hole had never been fixed. It was a bitch to unscrew the pieces holding the shaft to the grate, especially when dangling over it upside down, all without making any noise or using any chakra, but he managed. Once it was apart, he waited for another few moments even after he used the vent for an abbreviated visual recon of the Hokage's office. And was glad he did. Because all of a sudden, there was a nearly silent popping sound and a bit of smoke that signaled the release of extra chakra. Then the ninja pulled out 2 slips of paper, and with 2 more soft pops 2 more ninja appeared. Kakashi rubbed at his uncovered eye to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. Because though all 3 nins were well covered and likely would have been unrecognizable by anyone who didn't know them as well as he did, Kakashi knew exactly who they were. The why and how of his kids managing to infiltrate the Hokage's office was put on hold as he allowed himself a brief moment of pride mixed with incredulity. Because the brats had managed to break in a full 3 years younger than he'd himself managed. And with a number of years less training. Then he decided this could only reflect well on his abilities as a Junin sensei, so their breaking his record was perfectly acceptable. Then a shiver ran down his spine at another thought. For if this was what they got up to when he'd only been gone for 3 days, might the kami forbid he ever be sent on an extended mission, or he'd likely come back only to find they'd taken over the village in his absence. Then again, if they did, at least the third would stop trying to talk to him about succession plans. He shook his head and returned his attention to the situation at hand, watching as they went into a brief huddle then went straight to work. He was pleased that their training was holding, with Naruto acting as a watch while the other 2 searched for their objective, though he still had no idea what it could be. When Naruto bent to examine the door, Kakashi grew a bit concerned that he might become so involved in the seal work he knew covered all points of egress that the boy would either forget to keep watch or try to figure it out and accidentally set off an alarm. Then Sasuke announced he'd found their first objective, and Kakashi raised his eyebrows. The brats were certainly ambitious, going after multiple targets in the most secure building in Konoha. Kakashi took mental notes of their mistakes to were only Jinan, after all, so that he could both clean up after them and teach them not to do in the future. Sakura found the second shortly after Sasuke had, and they did an admirable job covering their tracks before disappearing in small puffs of smoke. Kakashi shook his head. Only his brats would break into the Hokage's office without actually being there at all. Rather ingenious of them, really. He waited another 100 count before getting to work himself. Back at Kakashi's apartment, Team 7 was sitting on the front stoop where they were inconspicuously conspicuous. There were at least a dozen shinobi who lived in Kakashi's building, making it much more visible than his clan house, and they'd made sure the shinobi had seen them lounging around after dinner, reading and talking and contemplating where their sensei might be. And even, at one particularly opportune time, the boys had started roughhousing in response to some pointed comments. That 3 jounin happened to all be near enough that they'd certainly noticed had absolutely nothing to do with it. Naruto loved that Kage Bunshine let him make his own alibi. When the Kage Bunshine dispelled from the Hokage's office, Sasuke and Sakura both jolted slightly. Naruto, on the other hand, had been using so many so often, he kept right on talking without even a hitch in his voice as he processed the information from his clone. They stayed out on the stoop for another 20 minutes before calling it a night and heading in. Well? Naruto asked when they were safe inside Kakashi's well-sealed walls. Naruto knew very well they were soundproof, in addition to a whole host of other protections. After all, Naruto had done the sealing. On the plus side, it didn't appear the complaints were driven by the hole, you know. Sakura waved her hand at Naruto's stomach in explanation. But on the minus side, it seems like they all have some sort of grudge against Sensei. Sasuke nodded in agreement with her analysis. There were complaints, then, Naruto stated. He'd hoped Ino had been wrong, but had learned long ago that it made much more sense to prepare for much worse. Ino wasn't lying. 3 Junin Sensei complained about Kaka Sensei, Sakura said, eyes and voice as flat and angry as Naruto had ever seen her. So the Hokage is doing an evaluation to determine whether he gets to stay in command of Team 7. Naruto's nails bit hard into his palms. It's why Genma is showing up instead of Kaka-sensei, or instead of putting us on leave, Sasuke said. He's evaluating our skills so he can provide a recommendation to an evaluation panel. Naruto hadn't thought Sasuke could be more blank or emotionless than he'd already seen him, but he had reached new heights. Of course, Sasuke was us backwards with everything, and the less he showed, the more he felt. Which meant Sasuke was feeling more than Naruto had ever seen. So what do we know about this evaluation? Naruto asked. The Hokage has commissioned a review and evaluation panel, Sakura explained. They look at the complaints in the independent Junin evaluation and a response from the Junin sensei under review. And they usually question all of the Jounin involved. Then sometimes they'll question the Junin, too, before making a recommendation to the Hokage. And it's scheduled for 1 week, when Kakashi-sensei gets back from his mission, Sasuke added. What did you find out about that? Sakura asked, not having seen that file in the Hokage's office. It was all coded, Sasuke hedged, glancing quickly to Sakura then away. But I know he's out looking into something, and was expected to be gone 10 days, starting 3 days ago. Naruto cocked his head in question while Sakura wasn't looking, and Sasuke responded by cutting his eyes directly to her, then looking back at him significantly. And Naruto understood why he'd prevaricated. It probably wouldn't be good for Sakura to know Kakashi was looking into her parents' deaths. So what's our plan? He asked, changing the subject. Prove Kaka-sensei has done a good job teaching us, Sakura said, a hard edge to her voice Naruto wasn't used to hearing there. And prove it any way we can. Those brats, Kakashi thought fondly. They were using both his apartment and his clan house. And he'd found Naruto had made inquiries all throughout the red light district for him. Kakashi still found it a bit awkward the girls seemed to all know he was Naruto's sensei, and made mention of it every single time. It was a good thing he hadn't planned to go to any of those places. Though it was nominally annoying that he couldn't had he wanted to. He slipped into one of the dozen or so little bolt holes he had secreted away throughout Konoha and began reviewing its security. Once he was satisfied that nothing could easily get in without his notice and that he could easily get out without anyone noticing, he sat down to contemplate what he'd found in the Hokage's office. And to plan. Danzo, it appeared, had been a larger pain in the Hokage's ass than he'd ever realized. And was responsible for far more than he'd ever thought possible. Before now, Kakashi had never thought him to be more than an annoyance, an old warhawk who was worth only limited concern and attention. It was time for that to change. Sakura knew she was the weakest of Team 7. She'd known the boys were quickly leaving her behind from the moment Naruto had created his first Onigiri clone. Oh, there had been signs of it before that. Of course, but Sakura had managed to dismiss them. Onigiri Bunshine blew all of that away. That was when she'd realized that if she'd wanted to keep up, she would have to make her own way. Not follow after Sasuke trying to mimic him in hopes he would pay attention to her like she had done at the academy. Not that she'd want to do that anymore anyway. She didn't need to, he already acknowledged her and she spent most of her waking hours with Team 7, and she couldn't follow Naruto or Kaka-sensei either. Because the fact of the matter was that none of the boys used anything that was well suited to her strengths. In fact, it was mostly the opposite as they were focused on areas that used her weaknesses. She did not have massive chakra stores for a ninjutsu specialist. The illogical sequences of Fuuin and Jutsu made her head hurt. She didn't have the body for taijutsu, and no strength to back it up. And she had no bloodline or, indeed, any family history of shinobi skills to fall back on. But that was alright. Sakura had wanted something of her own anyway. So she'd spent some time researching different areas she could pursue. She dabbled briefly with kenjutsu and weaponry, but she dismissed those quickly. Genjutsu intrigued her, but while she had the chakra control to be good at it, she lacked the imagination to truly become excellent. Then she'd stumbled across medical jutsu. And promptly fallen in love. It required chakra control honed to a razor-sharp point and a massive amount of book learning to understand how the body worked. Both of which played in perfectly to her strengths. Kakashi had been quietly proud of her for finding her niche, teaching her what little he knew and directing her to some scrolls and books he said he'd been told were excellent primers. Sasuke hadn't said anything, but after training one day she'd found a dozen scrolls in her pack detailing healing techniques. The Uchiha crest stamped at the top of them told her exactly where they'd come from. But Naruto crazy, lovable Naruto. He'd gotten the most legendary medic nin ever to agree to be her teacher. Then she'd promptly sided with Sasuke against him and had almost lost him for good. The depth of self-doubt Naruto had deep inside him still made her worried and a bit frightened for him. But she'd promised herself that she'd be a better friend and help him and all of her loved ones, and not lose anyone anymore. And she'd promised she would make up with her parents and explain it to them both what it meant to be a kunoichi. Then she'd come home and found she'd really lost her parents. And had suddenly lost herself. It had only been because of her team that she'd managed to come out of her grief. She still couldn't remember much from those first days other than their constant presence. And now, someone was trying to take Kaka-sensei away from her, and maybe break her entire team apart. Sakura narrowed her eyes as she unconsciously snarled. Over her dead body. You, Sakura pronounced, pointing angrily at Tsunade. I've had enough of your evasions and put-offs and half-assed remedial lessons. You're going to start taking me seriously, and you're going to start actually training me, and you're going to do it now. Tsunade only cocked an eyebrow as her mouth twitched. Well? Sakura demanded to know. Well, finally, Tsunade replied, rolling her eyes. I've been wondering when you'd come to me seriously. Sakura blinked. What? What, you didn't think all you'd have to do was show up and learn, did you? That idiot teammate of yours can line up whatever he wants for you, but you're the one who has to knock it down. Not even to clear me of all the debt I've ever accrued would I take on an apprentice I didn't think made the cut. But I do? Sakura asked. Tsunade gave her a disdainful once-over before sniffing in derision. Barely, she scoffed. The first cut anyway, I suppose. We'll see. Sakura nodded, determined to show her mettle. She'd never be so weak as to allow others to take away her loved ones ever again. She didn't catch Tsunade's self-satisfied grin as she turned away. We're in the middle of a lot of work here, you know, trying to get this school up and running, Tsunade said. I expect you to pull your own weight. Starting now. An herbal delivery was just made. Go deal with it. So I hear you've been asking after me. Jiraiya didn't start when Naruto sat down at his table without so much as a by your leave. The kid was good, but there was a reason Jiraiya was considered a legend. He did, however, raise an eyebrow at Naruto's statement. It was true, of course, but in his asking it, it answered more of his questions than his past few nights of inquiries had. Oh? Jiraiya asked. One of the easiest ways of getting information was, surprisingly, to say nothing at all and let the other person fill it in for you. Naruto just grinned and tilted back in his chair. Jiraiya wasn't sure if he knew that trick, or was just being annoying. Given what he knew of the brat, he thought the two had even odds. Is that so? What have you heard? Jiraiya asked, on the off chance Naruto simply hadn't understood and filled in the unspoken question. Why were you asking around about me? Naruto countered. Jiraiya poured himself another saucer of sake and took a long, slow sip. Because he'd been asking to find the truth of what Naruto had told him in the wave about growing up in Konoha's red light district, and trying to find out how and why he'd ended up there when he'd been assured time and again by the third that Naruto had been safe and well. Unfortunately, all he'd found was that none of his usual sources of information in the Akasen were forthcoming when he'd brought up Naruto's name. Everyone had suddenly become blind, deaf, dumb, and very busy somewhere else as soon as he'd asked. Oh yeah, that kid, and a shrug to go with it was the most Jiraiya had gotten out of anyone. And apparently, they'd gotten word of it all back to Naruto. Which answered the question of whether they were afraid of him, or afraid for him. Something he'd been more than a little concerned about, given Naruto was Shinobi trained, and for all that those who lived behind the red line lived rougher, tougher lives than any other in Konoha, it meant little when facing a shinobi. Is it a crime to want to find out more about my newest pupil? Jiraiya asked. Though, he considered, the resolution of his conversation with the third after what he'd found out about his newest pupil might result in a crime. Jiraiya did not consider growing up in Akasenko safe or well. Naruto appeared to be considering him and his words. Then he shook his head. I know most people don't think much of us, but we protect our own. And no matter how often you visit, you're not one of us. Even people who don't like me will keep that business from those who live on the other side of the red line. He paused, then gave a wry grin. Well, so long as there isn't anything of theirs at stake, anyway. Honor among thieves? Jiraiya asked, jokingly. More like we all give each other home field advantage, Naruto responded in kind, waving around him even as a serving girl set down another bottle of sake with a brief bow and left. Jiraiya was certain Naruto hadn't even ordered it. Now I have something important to talk to you about. Naruto dropped his chair back down to all four of its legs and leaned forward on his elbows. Oh? Jiraiya tried again, and this time Naruto obliged him. Kakashi-sensei has been put on review. Sasuke and Sakura and I wanted to make sure he comes out of it smelling like roses. I want you to help. This time, Jiraiya was startled. He'd heard the rumors, of course. That such an old-timer as Kakashi had burned out long ago. He hadn't realized anyone had taken it seriously. Then again, he considered, the majority of people were likely stupid enough to fall for Danzo's schemes. Jiraiya had long ago lost his faith in the general intelligence or goodness of man. Jiraiya mused. I'm surprised 3 complaints were made at all, much less in the few months he's had you 3. I suppose I shouldn't be, though. He could see Naruto about to explode in defense of Kakashi, and waved his hand to stop him. No, kid. I meant that Kakashi's always been picked on because he's always been one of Konoha's brightest stars. Brightest stars? Jiraiya asked himself incredulously. I must have had more sake than I realized. He's in line to be the next Hokage, you know, and that makes a lot of people jealous. Jiraiya found Naruto's contemplation of that last bit fascinating. He hadn't known someone could go through so many mental gymnastics in so short a time. But you like him, right? Naruto finally asked. So you'll help us, right? Sure, brat, Jiraiya said, taking another sip of the excellent sake Naruto had bought him. Now scram. So, you're evaluating Kakashi, are you? Jiraiya asked from his perch in the window. That he could arrive there unannounced by the Anbu just demonstrated his prowess in the shinobi arts. If such a thing were true, how might you have come to possess such information? The third asked. Surely it isn't being bandied about the hot springs you frequent. Oh, I have my ways. Did they include breaking into my office? Jiraiya's eyebrows rose in surprise as he pushed off the window and headed for one of the chairs. This looked to be a longer and much more interesting conversation than he'd thought. No, he replied bluntly. Are you saying someone managed that? Though who, how, and why is still a mystery. Nobody saw anything and none of the security seals were touched. Nothing was missing, and nothing was out of place. You can imagine that we're more than a little concerned over this breach in security. If all of what you say is true, then how could you tell? The Hokage steepled his hands in front of him and leaned forward on his desk. We have failsafe after failsafe, of course, he said. None dealing with entry or exit were set off. The one which reacts to any chakra usage was. It's also the only one that doesn't alert the Anbu in real time, and is checked every morning when the office is unsealed. The Hokage did not tell him that it was checked when they watered his office plants. The Anbu found it rather degrading to be set menial chores, but the chakra-sensitive plants the first had left were far more important than most of them knew. Besides, there had to be some perks to being Hokage. Jiraiya mused. Well, it wasn't me. I hate to give up my sources, but I suppose I can share that one of the kid's brats came to me about it. When the third raised an eyebrow in interest, Jiraiya took it as an invitation to continue. Oh yes, they know all about the review. They're as dangerously angry about it as I've ever seen a Jonin, and they're doing everything in their power to make you give Kakashi back to them. The grin on the Hokage's face reminded Jiraiya just why his old sensei was also still considered such a dangerous shinobi. Good, was all he said. Very good indeed. Good morning, Kuro-sensei, Sasuke greeted the Jounin politely. Do you mind if I join you for a moment? The Jounin gave him a quizzical look, but shrugged, and Sasuke took a seat on the stool next to his. A dango stand wasn't the prime place to speak with the man, but it was the best of the poor choices he'd found after following the Jounin since that morning. Sure, kid. What's up? I've come to ask a favor. And that burned deep into his pride. He could practically hear the ghost of his father lecturing that Uchiha did not ask favors, for a true Uchiha never needed one. But Naruto had sworn up, down, and sideways that if he said things exactly this way, it would work. And Naruto seemed born to talk people into doing things they didn't want to do. For example, getting Sasuke to ask a favor from a Jounin so maladroit he couldn't even detect a Jonin following him. Kuro blinked. From me? Sasuke nodded. I have found there is a defamation campaign being spread through rumors about my sensei, which has resulted in him being put unfairly on review for supposed negligence of my team's training, Sasuke said. As a Jounin who has been involved in an rank mission with us, I would like you to speak on his behalf. Are you willing? Ah, well. Kuro rubbed his mouth with his fingers, obviously a long-held nervous habit. I'm not sure I should get involved. Sasuke narrowed his eyes. A shame, he said. I had not wanted to get your Jonin to speak in your place, but if you are not honorable enough to come forward yourself and would instead lay it on their shoulders, well, I'm certain they would give a far more honest depiction of the events of both Jun and Sensei. Anyway. Johnny. He slid off his stool and made to leave when Kuro groaned and grabbed for him. Sasuke had to forcefully refrain himself from responding with a kunai point, but stabbing the man probably wouldn't help his cause any. No matter how much he did not like being touched. So instead, he twisted his arm and made a vigorous pull that let him slip out of the hold. "Yes, Kuro-sensei," he asked blandly. "When and where is this hearing?" Kuro said with a sigh. Sasuke passed along the details even as he marveled at how well Naruto had predicted the conversation, or Khan, as Sasuke was more inclined to seeing it, would go. And he didn't notice the keenly interested look of the woman at the other end of the dango stand. Genma headed into the waiting room with a limp, holding himself gingerly as he sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs that lined the walls. He didn't know what strings Kakashi or the Hokage had pulled to get the inquiry held so quickly, but he couldn't help but be grateful for it. If he ever had to lead Team 7 again, it would be too soon. Kakashi, he noted, was watching him with what appeared to be amusement on his face. "The bastard. Are you well, Genma?" Kakashi asked. Genma glared at him. "Fuck you," he said. Anything else he might have said was cut off when the door to the meeting room was opened and he was called in. Kakashi gave him a two-fingered wave and Genma sent him a one-fingered salute in return as he hobbled into the hearing. "Hokage-sama," Genma said, bowing carefully. He stood back up at attention, taking in the rest of the panel convened for the hearing. If he wasn't mistaken, of the 5 shinobi in the room other than himself and the Hokage, one of them was currently serving as the head of the Anbu division, one was a jounin who'd previously served as head of Anbu, one was the current high jounin, one was a retired shinobi who was still thought of as a legend in the community, and one was the head of Konoha's D&I. An illustrious group to serve as a panel for what should have been a simple matter. And a panel that made Genma wonder what the Hokage was playing at. "You have completed the evaluation?" The Hokage asked him and he nodded. "What are your findings?" "I can certify with complete confidence that there is absolutely no sign of negligence in the training or care of Team 7, Genma said. "In my estimation, all 3 students are well beyond the level expected of rookie Chunin." There was complete silence at this pronouncement. Even the Hokage seemed surprised. "On what do you base this claim?" the High Jounin asked. "Intelligence gathering and analysis, strategy, tactics and teamwork, nin-gen, and taijutsu, stealth and tracking," Genma ticked off on his fingers. "Need I continue? They're a remarkably well-rounded team. They each have their specialties, of course, but they all are proficient at the basics and then some. It is my opinion that Kakashi has done far more than required of him in the training of his students." "I find it interesting that you put intelligence first," Ibiki said. "Why is that?" Genma hesitated, then shrugged. "They know Kakashi is being reviewed," he said, noting again the surprise on the majority of the panel's faces even as the Hokage and Ibiki simply nodded in acknowledgement. "When I showed up instead of him, they were instantly defensive and suspicious. And they took steps to find out what was going on when I wouldn't tell them. And when I finished their evaluation this morning, they were quite clear in demonstrating to me the level of training they had been receiving." "Is that why you're babying your ribs?" the retired shinobi asked, a grin showing clearly on his face. He let out a sound that could have been perceived as agreement as he grimaced. Genma was pretty sure it was the pink one that had bruised his ribs. That out of the 3 of them it had been her to do it was more than a little embarrassing, but she had been particularly vicious in their spar. "Is there anything else you would like to add, Genma?" the Hokage asked. "If I have permission to speak freely," Genma responded. The Hokage's eyebrows lifted in surprise, clearly curious as to what he might have to say. And the other panel members didn't bother to hide their curiosity, either. "Permission granted," the Hokage said. "Then I'd like to say this, Kakashi was give 3 disasters for students. I read their files, and their assessments, and their psych write-ups before I went to evaluate them, and it was clear to me that they weren't expected to become much of anything. Instead, Kakashi has taken them and in just a few months turned them into ninja. The 3 of them are a cohesive unit and are so far ahead of the curve that I find it ridiculous anybody has even thought to question whether Kakashi has been training them sufficiently." Kakashi stood before the panel, head held high. He'd refused the offer of a seat, believing it better to accept the new standing. He didn't think they would take his kids away, and even if they did, he determined he wouldn't stop training them anyway. They lived with him, after all, and even if they did remove him as Junin-sensei, the kids were just barely old enough to petition for complete emancipation instead of the pseudo guardianship a Junin-sensei was given an orphan Junon, so there would be very little the interloper of a jounin assigned in his place could do about it. But that was putting the cart before the horse. He just hadn't realized how nervous he was about the decision until he was actually before the review board. "We have heard from many of Konoha's shinobi today," the Hokage began, focusing Kakashi's attention back on the present. I have called every jounin you served within the past year to speak, as your qualifications as a jounin were called into question as well as your teaching methods. We have heard from your students, and their evaluator. And we have had a few volunteers who demanded to be heard as well. Kakashi's spirits sunk at that. He could only imagine the shinobi he'd inadvertently shown up, or purposely dressed down for stupid mistakes getting their revenge. But surely, one or two would speak for him instead of against him. And if they didn't, he'd just challenge every shinobi in this room to prove their judgment sound. Of them all, the only one he had concerns about defeating was the Hokage himself. He tried to weigh his chances realistically and decided he had better than even odds, so long as the Hokage didn't summon the Monkey King. It is the unanimous decision of this panel that the complaints against you are meritless and completely without justification. Team 7 remains in your custody. Kakashi opened his mouth to protest, then blinked as what the Hokage said registered. And he blinked again. The panel is dismissed with my thanks, the Hokage continued on. Kakashi, if you'd accompany me to my office, I would like to discuss a few items with you, before you find your team. Kakashi nodded, though he knew the suggestion was really just a thinly veiled order. You should be proud of your students, the Hokage said as they made their way through the tower up to the Hokage's office. They made an exceptional effort on your behalf. It's flattering they would have spoken so well of me during their interview for you to make mention of it, Kakashi replied cautiously. Oh, they did more than that, the Hokage said, clearly amused. He sat and waved at a chair for Kakashi to sit in. This time, Kakashi dared not refuse. I understand they convinced a number of jounin to speak on your behalf and, somehow, most of the others we decided to call to speak of your abilities had somehow managed to accidentally oversee one of their training sessions, often on the same day, at the same time, though in many different training grounds. It was an amazing coincidence. Ah, ha ha. Kakashi rubbed the back of his head as he managed a brief laugh. I'll, make certain to discuss the importance of subtlety with them. Oh, no, I believe that in this instance, they never intended to be anything but unashamedly blatant in their efforts. I have every faith in the world they can be sly when the situation calls for it. The Hokage took a moment to light his pipe. By the way, did any of your old Onbu contacts mention to you that an intruder managed to infiltrate my office one night while you were away? It was easy to see where the Hokage was leading. And while he was glad he wasn't personally being suspected, then he'd made the connection to his team was more than a little troubling. Such an act could be considered treason. Is that so? Kakashi said. No, none had mentioned that. A remarkably sly job, too. In fact, we're still uncertain how the intruder slipped through all of our defenses, the Hokage said. If it happened that you found a certain group of Genin were responsible, I would be willing to grant amnesty for such an act, as the circumstances were extraordinary ones which I have no doubt put them under undue stress, so long as I received a detailed explanation for how such a feat were accomplished. In fact, I doubt any record of the offense would even exist after I received my explanation. I hear your words, Hokage-sama, Kakashi said solemnly, with more than a bit of relief. Good. Because, Kakashi? I want my explanation. The look on the Hokage's face made it clear that as lenient as he was being, he'd be doubly severe should he not be satisfied. As you say, Hokage-sama. And he would be certain to give the explanation as soon as he got it himself. Because even though he'd seen them in the office, he had no idea how the cage bunshines had gotten there. Good. The Hokage leaned back in his chair. I expect your team to go far. I have no doubt they'll be promoted in the next Chunin exams. You are planning to nominate them, aren't you? They're ready, Kakashi affirmed, though it hadn't seemed like much of a question. He wondered if it were unusual for the Hokage to take such an interest in a single team, but had no frame of reference. But then, he supposed, that if the Hokage were to be interested in any Genin team, his would certainly be it. The Hokage nodded once. Good. Very good. That should put the last of the rumors on your abilities as a sensei, at least, to rest. Kakashi stood and bowed, taking this as a dismissal. One last thing, the Hokage said. That man. I trust now you will take it seriously? It was Danzo he was referring to, of course, though even in the privacy of his own office, he would not name him without first dismissing the Onbu. Kakashi had thought such precautions unnecessary before. He'd learned better now. Very seriously, Kakashi agreed. Then I'll just remind you of the old shinobi saying, after victory, tighten your armor. Kakashi found himself tackled the moment he walked back into the house. At first he thought they were simply greeting him, then he thought they were playing. But when Naruto started writing on his foot, He realized it was something else. He twisted and turned, and before they knew what was going on, had them all bound together, back to back. "What have I told you three about taking on a Jounin?" he demanded. They stared at him sullenly. "Well?" He prompted. "That even 3-on-1, in a fair fight we'd lose." Sakura finally gave in with a sigh. "But it wasn't supposed to be a fair fight. And we only needed another few seconds anyway." Kakashi bent his leg so he could see what Naruto had been trying to write on the bottom of his foot. "Do I want to ask what you were trying to do to me?" he asked archly. "We couldn't find you," Naruto said, lip turned out a hair. Kakashi was a bit amused at the pout of real one, as he'd finally come to recognize the slightly larger one as part of Naruto's cons. "You were gone, and we couldn't find you. We decided to fix it so that couldn't happen again." Kakashi tilted his head, then slipped off all of their shoes to find identical smudges on their right feet. If he hadn't seen all three of them in a row, he'd have thought it a birthmark. "I take it mine would fade to this as well?" Naruto nodded. "What's it for?" "Let me activate yours and you'll find out," Naruto said with a pout. Kakashi just gave him an arch look. That was the pout that had managed to swindle him out of more bowls of ramen than he cared to think about. "We decided," Sasuke said, returning Kakashi's look with one of his own that was the epitome of Uchiha arrogance and condescension, "that we always want to be able to find each other." Kakashi grinned. "That's a good thought. But I'm a Jounin, and there are times when I'll need to be somewhere that you can't follow, even if you need me." Sasuke scowled while Sakura scrunched her nose and Naruto sighed. Kakashi's grin just got broader. "Now let's go celebrate. I'm thinking barbecue. Last one out the door treats," he tossed over his shoulder, leaving them to escape from the bonds on their own. When he turned back to the door, he found all three of them already waiting for him and the neatly coiled rope heading towards his head at an alarming rate. "Who said it was difficult to motivate teenagers?" "TCH, too slow," Kakashi said, shaking his head. "I'll expect better tomorrow. I'm going to find out exactly how much you let slide while I was away, and show you exactly why you should have made certain nothing slid at all." Their groans were music to his ears. It wasn't often that Kakashi found himself meeting with the Hokage and the High Jounin twice in as many days. Luckily, this second time he found himself in the company of all the other Junin-sensei. "I trust you're all aware of why you're here," the Hokage started, looking them all over. Kakashi didn't bother nodding, though he saw some who felt the need to, while some others actually shook their heads. He wondered how they'd become Jounin in the first place. "The Chunin exams will shortly be held in Konoha. You may submit your nominations to me today. We'll start with the 3 rookie Jounin teams." The Hokage looked directly at him, and Kakashi didn't disappoint. "Under the name of Hatake Kakashi, I nominate Team 7, consisting of Uchiha Sasuke, Uzumaki Naruto, and Haruno Sakura." There was an explosion of sound at his pronouncement. "A rookie team? I thought he was under review? How could they be ready? I've held my team back for 3 exams, and he thinks they can go to their first? But he's just a burnout." "Enough," the Hokage demanded, silencing the room immediately. "If you feel you have a valid protest, make it to me now, under your own name." "I've already done so, Hokage-sama," Asuma said. And the room went from silent to deathly still. "Ah, yes. The so-called complaint you levied against Kakashi was dealt with in a formal review, which ended yesterday," the Hokage said. Kakashi would have sighed if it wouldn't have sent more of a message to the other Jounin than he wished to make. "All complaints were found to be meritless," the Hokage continued. Among others, Jiraiya and Tsunade both spoke on his behalf. Kakashi saw Asuma's back go stick straight. "But Hokage-sama," Kurenai interjected, and Kakashi could tell it was more for Asuma's sake than against Kakashi's character. He still found it annoying. "No. I convened 5 of the most senior shinobi to sit on the review panel, which was held in strict accordance to the regulations governing such a thing. The decision was unanimous. Furthermore, I wanted to make it clear to all here, I do not appreciate my time being wasted. I especially do not appreciate my time being wasted when my Jounin use that which is meant to protect children to further petty squabbles. If there is a true concern, I want it addressed. If there is only animosity or jealousy between 2 Jounin, I expect you to act as a proud shinobi of Konoha and put it aside while acting in your official capacity. If this happens again, if my time is wasted again because one Junin-sensei filed a complaint against another Junin-sensei over a childish squabble, here will be consequences." The silence following his pronouncement was oppressive. "Now, we have Team 7 nominated," the Hokage continued after an appropriate pause. "What of the other 2 rookie Jounin teams? Mo, take one of these, will you?" Kakashi told his team as they ate dinner. He wasn't certain when they'd started all having evening meals together, but he wasn't certain it was something he was eager to stop. So for now, he'd just go with it. Besides, he could, and did, leave on his own afterwards. He watched as they looked first to the nomination forms, then to each other, then, and finally to him. "The Chunin exams?" Naruto finally asked. He agreed. "Do you really think we can pass?" Sakura was biting her lip, clearly concerned. "You're not just going to pass," Kakashi ordered. "You're going to blow the competition completely out of the water. So if you feel you can, don't bother even showing up." That got him a few raised eyebrows, but then Sakura and Naruto grinned, and Sasuke even gave a slight nod. Yes, he thought. They'd do just fine. And if they happened to smash the other rookie teams while they were at it, well, there was nothing wrong with a little satisfaction at a job well done. That's it for this video. I hope you all enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and follow me on my other social media accounts. Anime God here, and I'm signing off.